Hey there, tonight we're diving into a tranquil stroll through 1920s Harlem, where jazz melodies float through the streets. But the truth is, it wasn't all flappers and speakeasies. What you're about to discover is a vibrant community weaving resilience through rhythm. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now find your comfort zone, perhaps turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's venture into tonight's story together. The air pulses with a heady mix of jazz rhythms, and the scent of sweet pies cooling on windowsills. Welcome to Harlem in the early 1920s, where every corner holds the promise of something new. Your shoes tap against the cobblestones, caught in a rhythm that seems to echo the heartbeats of the Great Migration itself. Over 6 million African Americans left the rural South for the urban North between 1916 and 1970, and right now, you're standing at the epicenter of that seismic shift. Harlem wasn't just a neighborhood, it was the cultural crucible where African American identity was being reforged. Now, don't get too swept away by the romanticized image of Harlem as merely the jazz-soaked paradise of the Roaring Twenties. Sure, Louis Armstrong might be blowing his trumpet just around the corner, but let's not forget the economic context that turned this slice of Manhattan into a cultural mecca. The Great Migration was driven by a search for dignity, jobs, and a life free from the oppressive Jim Crow laws of the South. This was no leisurely stroll uptown. It was a march toward opportunity. And opportunity, in this case, took the form of jobs in the burgeoning industries of the North. The economic boom following World War drew people like a magnet. Jobs in factories, railroads, and service industries promised better wages than sharecropping ever could, even if it meant working grueling hours. And let's face it, the North had its own brand of racism, less overt perhaps, but no less insidious. But in Harlem, there was a chance to build a community that wasn't constantly under the thumb of oppressive laws and attitudes. As you walk these streets, take a moment to appreciate the architecture. Those brownstones and apartment buildings are filling up fast. During the Great Migration, Harlem's population exploded. By 1920, the neighborhood had transformed from a predominantly white enclave to a thriving African-American hub. Rent for a small apartment. Try $10 a month. Seems like a steal until you realize that $10 back then is roughly equivalent to $140 today, adjusted for inflation. Still think your rent's a rip-off. At least you don't have to dodge around the fact that landlords often hiked prices for black tenants, banking on the lack of housing options elsewhere. The influx of new residents created a vibrant tapestry of cultural and social life. The Harlem Renaissance was just warming up, a creative revolution that would explode into literature, music, and art that spoke truth to power. But here's where myth meets reality. This wasn't just a fancy art movement. It was a response, a defiant shout against the notion that African Americans had no culture worth celebrating. Writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston weren't just entertaining. They were documenting the African American experience in a way that demanded recognition and respect. And let's talk numbers. By 1925, Harlem had about 200,000 black residents, which was roughly 33% of New York City's total black population at the time. Imagine the energy, the ambition, the sheer willpower concentrated in these few square miles. It's a wonder the sidewalks didn't crack under the pressure of so many dreams. As you stroll past the bustling storefronts and lively street corners, consider this. Harlem was a microcosm of the broader social and economic changes reshaping America. It was a place where the tensions of the era played out in vivid color. The economic boom brought opportunity, but also competition and conflict. The cultural renaissance offered pride and visibility, yet it unfolded against a backdrop of ongoing racial discrimination. Your walk through Harlem is more than a step through history. It's a journey into the heart of a community that refused to be defined solely by its struggles. Here, in the early 1920s, Harlem is both a haven and a battleground, where the future of African American culture and identity is being fiercely negotiated. Soak it all in, because this is more than a neighborhood, it's a movement. So, as you continue your stroll through the vibrant, cacophonous streets of Harlem, let's dive headfirst into the cultural maelstrom known as the Harlem Renaissance. This wasn't just a footnote in American history. It was an entire chapter that redefined what it meant to be black in America. And who better to guide us through this artistic upheaval than Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, literary titans whose pens dripped with both ink and revolution. Langston Hughes, often dubbed the poet laureate of Harlem, wasn't your typical brooding artist. No, Hughes was a man who could capture the essence of the African-American experience in one succinct line and still make you chuckle. Born in 1902, Hughes was the son of a lawyer and a school teacher. But don't let that fool you into thinking he had an easy ride. His parents split when he was young, and Hughes was shuffled between various relatives, gathering stories and experiences like a literary magpie. By the time he hit Harlem, he had a head full of dreams and a typewriter ready to spill them out. Hughes wasn't just writing poetry, though. He was crafting a new narrative. The 1920s were ripe for innovation, and Hughes seized the moment to smash stereotypes and elevate African-American culture. His poems, like The Negro Speaks of Rivers, were both a celebration and a lament, painting pictures of both the joy and the struggle inherent in black life. When he famously penned, "What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun?" He wasn't just asking a rhetorical question. He was challenging a nation to look inward. And then there was Zora Neale Hurston, a woman who could write circles around most of her contemporaries while wearing a stylish hat. Born in 1891 in Notasulga, Alabama, Hurston's life was a testament to perseverance. After her mother died when she was just 13, Hurston was sent to boarding school, but she eventually had to leave due to financial constraints. But you couldn't keep her down for long. She worked various odd jobs, eventually making her way to Howard University and later securing a scholarship to Barnard College, where she became the first black woman to study there. Talk about smashing ceilings. Hurston was a force of nature in Harlem's literary scene. Her work, particularly the novel Their Eyes Were Watching God, was groundbreaking in its exploration of African-American female identity. She captured the dialect, the culture, and the spirit of black life in the South with such authenticity that you could almost taste the salt of the sea and hear the hum of the cicadas. Hurston's work was unapologetically black, and she reveled in it, even as she faced criticism from peers who thought she wasn't political enough. Now, let's debunk a popular myth about the Harlem Renaissance and its so-called carefree jazz age. Sure, flappers and dappers might have been cutting a rug at the Carton Club, but don't let the glitz and glam fool you. Beneath the sequin dresses and bodies was a harsh reality. Racial segregation and economic disparity were alive and kicking. The Carton Club, for example, was a whites-only establishment. African-American performers like Duke Ellington and Cab Calloway could entertain the crowds, but they couldn't sit among them. Talk about a bitter pill to swallow. The economic landscape wasn't exactly a bed of roses, either. The post-World War I boom might have brought jobs, but they weren't distributed evenly. African Americans often found themselves in the lowest-paying positions, with little room for advancement. By the late 1920s, unemployment rates for black Americans were double those of their white counterparts, a statistic that was as infuriating as it was predictable. It's like being invited to a feast only to find out you're stuck on dish duty. Despite these barriers, Harlem thrived as a cultural and intellectual hub. The Renaissance wasn't just about art and literature. It was a full-throttle movement that included music, philosophy, and politics. It was the era of jazz, with legends like Louis Armstrong and Bessie Smith redefining American music. Jazz was more than just a sound. It was an attitude, a rebellion wrapped in syncopated rhythms. However, let's not gloss over the fact that while jazz clubs were popping up like mushrooms after a rainstorm, they were often segregated spaces. Black musicians were the backbone of the scene, yet they were frequently barred from partaking in the nightlife they animated. The irony was thicker than a New York fog, and the Great Depression was looming ominously over this cultural boom, ready to crash the party. As the stock market tumbled in 1929, Harlem's economic woes deepened. The crash didn't just deflate wallets, it deflated dreams. Yet in the face of adversity, the resilience of the Harlem community shone through. It was as if the struggle itself became a canvas for creativity, and the artists of the Harlem Renaissance painted it with bold, vibrant strokes. So, as you stand here in the midst of this electrifying era, remember that the Harlem Renaissance was a patchwork of contradictions, a time of both incredible artistic expression and undeniable social inequities. It was a period where the clinking of cocktail glasses mingled with the echoes of protest songs, and where the streets buzzed with both jazz melodies and the rumblings of change. Harlem in the 1920s was a place of dreams deferred, dreams realized, and dreams yet to be dreamed. As you soak it all in, keep in mind that this is just the beginning. The story of Harlem is far from over, and the next chapter promises to be just as compelling. As the curtain rises on Harlem's political stage in the 1920s, you're about to meet a character whose ambitions were as grand as his rhetoric was fiery: Marcus Garvey. Now, Garvey wasn't your run-of-the-mill activist. Oh no, he was a larger-than-life figure with a vision that stretched across oceans and an accent as thick as his dreams were vast. Born in Jamaica in 1887, Garvey launched the Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, in 1914, and by the time he strutted onto Harlem's bustling avenues, he had a full head of steam and a mission: to unite people of African descent worldwide and ultimately create a self-sufficient empire in Africa. Garvey's charisma was undeniable, and his message resonated like a trumpet in a jazz club. The UNIA was all about black pride, economic independence, and fostering a global black identity. But let's not sugarcoat it. Garvey's vision was as controversial as it was compelling. He preached a back-to-Africa movement, urging African Americans to return to the motherland and build a black nation. In an era where Jim Crow was the law of the land and racism was as American as apple pie, the idea of packing up and setting sail for a new life was both alluring and impractical for many. Garvey didn't just talk the talk. He strutted his stuff through Harlem streets in military-style regalia, complete with plumed hats and gold braid. Think less run-of-the-mill activist and more emperor in exile. His Pan-Africanism was a bold counterpoint to the integrationist strategies of other civil rights leaders of the time. While some were trying to break down the walls of segregation, Garvey was busy building a palace in his mind, complete with a throne and a crown. His Black Star Line, a shipping company meant to transport goods and eventually people between Africa and the Americas, was one of his boldest initiatives. It sounds like a grand idea, right? But the reality was a bit more turbulent than a smooth cruise across the Atlantic. The company was plagued by mismanagement, financial woes, and legal troubles. Ships were bought for inflated prices and were often in such poor condition that they would have made even the most daring sailor seasick just looking at them. Then there's the economic context. African Americans, despite the promise of better wages in the North, were often earning only a fraction of what white workers took home. The idea of buying shares in a shipping company when you're struggling to put food on the table was a luxury many simply couldn't afford. Yet Garvey's dream was intoxicating, a heady mix of hope and hubris that drew in thousands. By 1920, the UNIA claimed over 4 million members, though critics would say that number was as inflated as his ambitions. So, here's the myth-busting reality check. Marcus Garvey was both a visionary and a flawed leader. His message of empowerment was a beacon for those weary of systemic oppression, but his execution left much to be desired. While he preached unity, he often found himself at odds with other black leaders who criticized his separatist approach and questioned his financial dealings. W.E.B. Du Bois, a leading intellectual of the time, famously referred to Garvey as the most dangerous enemy of the Negro race in America and the world. Now, let's pivot from the grandiose to the gritty. Harlem in the 1920s was not just a cultural and political hub, but also a testament to the power of collective resilience. Systemic racism was the unwelcome guest at every table, and African Americans in Harlem faced significant challenges in gaining political representation. Despite the vibrant community life, the political machine was still largely controlled by white politicians who had little interest in addressing the needs and concerns of black constituents. The right to vote was technically available to African Americans, but voter suppression tactics, such as literacy tests and intimidation, were rampant. The Harlem Renaissance, despite its cultural triumphs, unfolded against a backdrop of political disenfranchisement. In 1929, New York finally elected its first African American to the state legislature, Edward A. Johnson. But let's be real. One man in a sea of political sharks wasn't exactly the cavalry. The struggle for political representation was a marathon, not a sprint, and Harlem was still miles from the finish line. As you walk these storied streets, remember that Harlem was a crucible of contradictions. It was a place where dreams were both born and deferred, where the melodies of jazz mingled with the cries for justice. Marcus Garvey's legacy is as complex as the era itself, a mix of aspiration and adversity, brilliance and blunders. In the patchwork quilt of Harlem's history, his story is a vivid square, sewn with both golden threads and frayed edges. Stay tuned, because Harlem's story is far from over. The seeds of change that were planted in the 1920 will continue to grow, even as they face the harsh winds of oppression and economic hardship. The next chapter promises to be just as riveting, as Harlem's residents continue to navigate the turbulent waters of their time, crafting a legacy that will echo through the ages. And so, as the night falls over Harlem and the streets begin to hum with possibility, let's take a detour down 135th Street, where the real magic happens after dark. This is where Harlem comes alive, shedding the day's worries in favor of the evening's promise. Now, if the Harlem Renaissance was the heartbeat of culture, then its nightlife was the pulse, thrumming with jazz, packed dance floors, and the intoxicating allure of a society pushing against its confines. First stop, the Carton Club, the most famous joint in town, a name so swanky it practically drips with champagne. Picture this, a venue that screams opulence, yet whispers segregation. This was the paradox of the Carton Club, a place where black talent was on full display, yet it operated under a strict, whites-only patron policy. It was like being invited to a party, and then told you could only serve drinks. Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, and even the legendary Lena Horne graced its stage, yet they couldn't mingle with the crowd. A night at the Carton Club would set you back about $3, a princely sum considering the average worker might earn around $25 a week. Adjusted for today's inflation, you're looking at roughly $45 just to get in the door, not to mention the cost of drinks, which were technically illegal but flowed more freely than the Hudson River thanks to prohibition. The irony of sipping illegal hooch in a legal club wasn't lost on anyone. But let's step away from the glitz for a moment and head to the smaller venues, the real soul of Harlem's nightlife. These were the community-centered clubs and speakeasies tucked away in basements and backrooms, places like the Savoy Ballroom and the Apollo Theater. Here, the music was just as hot, but the vibe was as warm as a summer night. These venues welcomed everyone, regardless of skin color, as long as you could keep up with the rhythm. The economics of these places were a bit kinder to the average wallet. A night out at the Savoy might cost you around 50 cents. Not exactly pocket change, but far more accessible than the exclusive quarters of the Carton Club. Here, the floor was open to all, a swirling sea of dancers caught in the ebbs and flows of the music. It was a place where people came to forget the mundane and embrace the extraordinary, at least until the sun peeked over the horizon and reality beckoned once more. And then there was prohibition, a law that was about as popular as a skunk at a garden party, but just as pervasive. Officially, alcohol was banned, but in reality, it was the lifeblood of the nightlife, the not-so-secret ingredient that kept the jazz age in full swing. Speakeasies were the places where you could find a drink and a good time, provided you knew the right password or handshake. They became the undercurrent of the social scene, where people from all walks of life mingled in the smoky haze of rebellion. Prohibition, in all its misguided glory, inadvertently fueled the era's clandestine culture. It turned ordinary citizens into amateur bootleggers and made outlaws of musicians and bartenders. The very act of drinking became a form of protest, a nod to personal freedom wrapped in a glass. This was a time when the law was a suggestion, and the night was an opportunity, a chance to escape the constraints of reality and dance along the line between legality and liberty. In Harlem, this dance was performed with extra flair, as African Americans carved out spaces where they could express themselves freely, away from the watchful eyes of a society that tried to keep them in the shadows. These venues weren't just places to drink and dance. They were sanctuaries, where jazz was the language and rhythm was the heartbeat. The music was more than entertainment. It was a declaration of existence, a proclamation that echoed through the walls and into the streets. As the night deepens, consider the broader implications of this nightlife scene. It was a microcosm of the era's broader social tensions, a clash between the conservative forces trying to maintain the status quo and the progressive currents determined to forge new paths. The nightlife of Harlem was a stage where these tensions played out, fueled by the intoxicating mix of music, alcohol, and the unyielding spirit of a community in motion. So, while the Carton Club glittered with an air of exclusivity, remember that the real heart of Harlem's nightlife beat within the walls of its smaller venues. These were the places where legends were born and where the community gathered to celebrate life in all its messy, beautiful complexity. Here, amidst the laughter and the music, the dreams of a generation danced alongside the reality of the era, each step a reminder that even in the face of adversity, the spirit of Harlem was unbreakable. As you wander back into the night, let the echoes of jazz be your guide, a reminder that Harlem was more than just a place. It was a living, breathing testament to the power of resilience and creativity. The story of Harlem's nightlife is a tale of contradiction and celebration, a dance between the shadows and the spotlight, a melody that continues to resonate through time. So keep your ears open and your feet moving, because this journey is far from over, and the next chapter is waiting to unfold. Stepping out into the night, as the jazz rhythms fade into the background and the streets recede into shadows, it's time to reflect on what makes Harlem more than just a chapter in a history book. Harlem in the 1920s and 30s wasn't just a geographical location. It was a beacon. It was a place where dreams were dreamt in technicolor, even if the world outside insisted on seeing in black and white. As the Great Depression loomed like a storm cloud ready to burst, Harlem stood at a crossroads, caught between the vibrancy of its cultural revolution and the harsh realities of economic despair. The 1929 stock market crash wasn't just a financial hiccup. It was a seismic event that sent shockwaves through communities nationwide, Harlem included. Picture this: unemployment rates soaring, breadlines stretching around corners, and a community left grappling with the collapse of its economic foundation. For Harlem's residents, already facing wage disparities and systemic racism, the Depression was like being handed a raincoat with holes in a downpour. By 1932, Harlem's unemployment rates had skyrocketed to around 50%, a stark contrast to the national rate of about 23%. The neighborhood, once a symbol of possibility, now found itself drowning in poverty and uncertainty. But the story of Harlem isn't just one of struggle. It's a testament to resilience. While the economic landscape was as bleak as a November sky, the cultural legacy of Harlem thrived. The Harlem Renaissance had already planted seeds that would blossom into a lasting influence on American music, literature, and civil rights movements. Artists, writers, and musicians continued to create, their work serving as both a mirror reflecting society's flaws and a hammer poised to reshape them. When times got tough, the community doubled down on its creativity. It's like they took the adage, necessity is the mother of invention, and added a syncopated jazz rhythm to it. Take, for instance, the world of music. Jazz and blues, birthed in the smoky clubs of Harlem, would go on to become the soundtrack of America. Musicians like Duke Ellington and Billie Holiday transcended their Harlem roots to become household names, their melodies echoing not just in swanky clubs, but in the hearts of people worldwide. The improvisational nature of jazz, with its unpredictable twists and turns, mirrored the resourcefulness of a community navigating uncertain times. It's like life handed them a blues scale, and they turned it into a symphony. Literature, too, bore the indelible stamp of Harlem. Writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston didn't just capture the African-American experience. They elevated it to a place of prominence and respect. Hughes's poignant lines about deferred dreams and Hurston's vibrant narratives of black life offered a lens through which the world could view the richness of African-American culture. Their work wasn't just writing. It was a declaration, a fierce insistence that African-American stories were worth telling. And in a world that often relegated such voices to the margins, their words were both rebellion and revelation. Perhaps one of the most enduring legacies of Harlem is its impact on the civil rights movement. The ideas that flourished in the Harlem Renaissance would become the intellectual underpinnings of the struggle for equality. Figures like W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, despite their differing approaches, laid down a blueprint for activism that future generations would follow. Harlem was a crucible where ideas of black identity, pride, and self-determination were forged, and then carried forth into the broader civil rights movement. It's as if Harlem was the rehearsal space for a national performance on the stage of history. And let's not forget the mythic allure of Harlem, which continues to captivate. Sure, the romanticized image of a jazz-soaked paradise has its appeal, the kind that makes you want to don a flapper dress or a pinstripe suit and dance the night away. But beneath the feathers and fringe, Harlem was a place of profound complexity, a story of triumphs marred by struggle, of voices that refused to be silenced. As we wrap up this journey through time, let's acknowledge the duality of Harlem's legacy, an interplay of light and shadow, of hope and hardship. It's a tale that's as relevant today as it was then, a reminder that the fight for equality and cultural recognition is an ongoing narrative. Harlem's story is woven into the very fabric of American history, its threads both vibrant and frayed, telling a story that's still being written. So, the next time you hear a jazz melody wafting through the air or read a line of poetry that stirs your soul, remember the streets of Harlem where it all began. Remember the people who, despite the weight of the world pressing down, chose to rise, to create, to inspire. Harlem wasn't just a place on a map. It was, and continues to be, a movement, a testament to the power of art and the resilience of the human spirit. And as you let these thoughts dance in your mind, consider how the echoes of Harlem's past still resonate in today's conversations about culture, identity, and justice. The stage has changed, but the performance continues, a perpetual reminder that history isn't just about the past. It's about the stories we carry forward, the lessons we learn, and the dreams we dare to dream. So, here's to Harlem, both a memory and a muse, forever etched in the annals of time, ever inspiring, ever evolving. In the bustling heart of ancient Rome, where the clang of swords and the clamor of citizens intertwined to form a chaotic symphony, money wasn't just a tool, it was an art form. Dive into the 4th century BCE, a time when banking wasn't the sleek, digital experience of today, but a lively, hands-on affair, conducted in the open-air theater of life known as the Forum Romanum. Picture it, a motley crew of moneylenders, the Argentarii, peddling finances as casually as a modern-day barista slings lattes. These guys weren't just the predecessors of your local credit union. They were the linchpins of Roman economic prosperity, operating in a system that was as much about trust as it was about coins. The Argentarii, whose name, if you're curious, literally translates to silver men, weren't just counting denarii in back rooms. Nope, these were the financial maestros of the Roman Republic, setting up shop smack dab in public squares where every deal was a spectacle. Think of them as the OG influencers, only instead of flogging detox teas, they were peddling loans and managing deposits. They were the guys you went to if you needed some quick sesterces to fund, say, a small army or a particularly extravagant toga party. Now, before we get too cozy with the romantic notion of Roman banking, let's debunk a myth or two. The idea of sophisticated financial systems often conjures images of marble halls and scholarly discussions. But in reality, transactions were more akin to a noisy bazaar than a quiet library. Argentarii operated in the Forum Romanum, which was less Wall Street and more flea market, with the added bonus of political intrigue and the occasional gladiator. Deals were struck with a handshake, and maybe a few witnesses if you were lucky, not unlike borrowing $20 from a friend, with the tacit understanding you might forget to pay them back. The Roman economy, while seemingly chaotic, was a well-oiled machine powered by these moneylenders. They were the facilitators of commerce, loaning cash to merchants and farmers who, without this financial boost, might have been stuck peddling grapes and olives from a roadside stall. And let's not forget their role in the political sphere, financing campaigns for those ambitious enough to climb the slippery pole of Roman politics. The stakes were high, and the Argentarii were the ones holding the ladder. It's easy to romanticize this era of banking as an idyllic age of straightforward transactions. But hold onto your laurels, Because this was a world rife with risk. The absence of a centralized banking system meant that if your friendly neighborhood Argentarius went bust, so did your savings. It wasn't uncommon for a moneylender to disappear faster than a Roman candle on Saturnalia, leaving creditors to mourn their vanished denarii. Yet somehow, this precarious system thrived for centuries, a testament to the Romans' ability to navigate chaos with a shrug and a bit of bravado. The Forum wasn't just a place to talk shop. It was a stage where the drama of daily life played out in full view. Imagine the scene. A bustling center where patricians and plebeians rubbed shoulders, where political plots were hatched over cups of watered-down wine, and where financial fortunes were made and lost in the blink of an eye. It's no wonder the Argentarii thrived here. They were at the center of everything, the social butterflies of the Roman world, flitting between deals with the agility of a cat navigating a crowded alleyway. Despite the inherent risks, these early bankers were essential to the growth of Rome, from a scrappy city-state to a sprawling empire. They fueled trade, supported military campaigns, and greased the wheels of politics, playing a role that was as indispensable as it was precarious. And while today's banking might involve less public spectacle and more sterile cubicles, the legacy of the Argentarii lives on, a reminder that even in the ancient world, money was the ultimate power player. So, next time you're standing in line at the bank or tapping through a mobile app, spare a thought for those silver men of yore, who managed to juggle coins, customers, and chaos with nothing but a ledger and a sharp wit. They were the unsung heroes of Rome's economic might, the financial wizards who turned the clinking of coins into the symphony of an empire. The Argentarii may have been the rock stars of the Forum, but let's not kid ourselves. Banking in the Roman Republic was hardly a free-for-all. As the Republic expanded, so did its financial needs, and with new territories came new opportunities for commerce, and of course chaos. That's where things get spicy, the introduction of formal banking practices. Yes, those crafty Romans had deposit accounts and loans, albeit in their own peculiar fashion. Deposit accounts were the bread and butter of Roman banking. They were as straightforward as they come. You handed over your coins to an Argentarius who would keep them safe in his, let's say, well-guarded purse. In return, you got a little something called a nomen, a sort of IOU that could be passed around more conveniently than a sack of denarii. Need to pay a merchant? Just hand over a nomen. Sure, it sounds like the precursor to the modern checking account, but let's not get carried away. Forgery was rampant, and records were about as reliable as a Roman weatherman predicting a sunny day during a thunderstorm. Loans, on the other hand, were where the Argentarii got to show off their shrewdness. These weren't your friendly neighborhood loans with reasonable interest rates. Oh no, the Romans were charging rates that could make a payday lender blush. It wasn't uncommon for interest rates to soar up to 12% annually, a hefty sum when you're betting on the next gladiator match to pay it off. But those with a keen eye for opportunity could make a killing. Just ask any ambitious senator who borrowed to finance a political campaign. Of course, high stakes mean higher risks, and a failed venture could leave you more washed up than a Roman shipwreck. Now, enter the Lex Claudia of 218 BCE, a piece of legislation that tried to rein in the financial free-for-all. It was the Roman Senate's attempt to put some guardrails on this wild ride, particularly targeting senators who dabbled in commerce, declaring they couldn't own ships. The idea was to curb conflicts of interest, but let's face it, the law was about as effective as a wax shield in a battle. Senators found loopholes faster than you can say, res publica. They'd have their freedmen or clients own the ships instead, skirting the law while keeping their investments afloat. Sound familiar? It's the ancient equivalent of modern-day banker shenanigans with offshore accounts. The beauty of Roman law was its adaptability. When one loophole closed, another opened, much like a game of legislative whack-a-mole. The persistence of these financial tricks speaks volumes about human nature. Where there's a will to make cestus's, there's a way, even if it involves a bit of creative interpretation. In the grand tapestry of Roman history, these banking practices were more than just economic maneuvers. They were reflections of the Republic's shifting priorities and expanding ambitions. As Rome grew, so did its appetite for control and innovation. Banking wasn't just a means to an end. It became an integral part of Rome's identity, shaping its society in ways that still echo today. The Roman banking system, with its mix of brilliance and bedlam, laid the groundwork for future financial systems. It's a testament to the ingenuity and adaptability of the Romans, who took what was available and spun it into economic gold. Yet, it's also a cautionary tale of how power and money can twist even the best intentions into something far more self-serving. So next time you're navigating the complexities of modern finance, remember the Romans were there first, navigating their own economic labyrinth with nothing more than a sharp mind and a few well-placed denarii. They were the pioneers of financial audacity, proving that when it comes to banking, some things never change. Just when you thought the Romans had exhausted their pool of financial cleverness, enter the publicani, the tax farmers who took the empire's money game to a whole new level. If you think filing your taxes is a headache now, imagine dealing with these guys. Publicani were essentially the IRS of ancient Rome, minus the calculators, and with a penchant for creative accounting that would make any modern tax evader blush. These tax farmers were private contractors who bid for the right to collect taxes in specific provinces. Picture this: a bustling auction where wealthy elites competed to win the dubious honor of squeezing coins from the farthest corners of the empire. In exchange for a hefty upfront payment to the state, they were granted free rein to collect taxes from the local populace. It was as if the Romans handed over their tax system to the highest bidder and said, "Good luck, and don't forget our cut." Publicani were no ordinary collectors. They were financial whizzes who turned tax farming into a high-stakes business. They weren't in it for the love of spreadsheets, after all. Their goal was simple: collect more than they paid to the state and pocket the difference. This led to some rather inventive methods of tax collection. Think of them as the original masters of upselling, only instead of convincing you to supersize your fries, they were coaxing extra sesterces from hard-pressed provincials. What's fascinating, and a bit disconcerting, is the extent to which these publicani influenced the political landscape of Rome. Their operations were so lucrative that they wielded significant power, often using their wealth to finance political campaigns and curry favor with influential senators. Sound familiar? That's because the publicani were ancient counterparts of today's lobbyists, using their financial clout to shape policy in their favor. They were the puppet masters behind the curtain, pulling strings with a deftness that would make any modern political strategist envious. As the empire expanded, so did the complexity of its financial instruments. The Romans, ever the innovators, began to develop more sophisticated forms of credit and debt. One such innovation was the Fenus Nordicum, or maritime loan, a specialized financial product that allowed merchants to fund risky overseas ventures. The catch: these loans came with interest rates that shot up faster than a Roman galley in full sail. But as with all high-risk investments, the potential rewards were equally enticing. Merchants who successfully navigated the treacherous waters of trade could see their fortunes multiply faster than you could say, Carthago delenda, est. The banking sector also saw the rise of syngraphy, written financial contracts that formalized agreements between parties. These contracts were a step towards modern banking practices, providing a semblance of security in an otherwise volatile market. Still, the system was far from foolproof. Forgery was rampant, and disputes over these contracts often ended in the courts, providing endless fodder for the gossiping denizens of the forum. Despite their legal limitations, these financial instruments were crucial in facilitating the flow of capital across the empire. They allowed commerce to thrive, funding everything from grain shipments to military campaigns. The Romans understood that money, like water, needed to flow freely to sustain the empire's might. Banking institutions became the conduits for this economic lifeblood, their influence permeating every facet of Roman life. Of course, with great power came great potential for corruption. The line between banker and politician blurred as financiers used their wealth to sway political decisions. It was a case of money talking, loudly, and those with the deepest pockets often called the shots. The influence of these early banks in politics laid the foundation for a relationship between finance and governance that persists to this day. But let's not get too starry-eyed about the Roman banking system. While it was undoubtedly revolutionary for its time, it was also as chaotic as a chariot race. The lack of a centralized banking authority meant that financial stability was often at the mercy of individual ambition and greed. Bankers could and did, manipulate the system for personal gain, leaving the less fortunate to pick up the pieces. Yet, despite these challenges, Roman banking reached its zenith during the empire. It was a system built on innovation and audacity, a testament to the Romans' ability to adapt and thrive in an ever-changing world. The legacy of Roman banking is a reminder that while the tools may change, the game remains very much the same. As we look back on this era, it's tempting to romanticize the notion of Roman bankers as shrewd, calculating visionaries. But reality, as always, was more complicated. These were men operating in a world of uncertainty, where fortunes could be made and lost with a single bad investment. They were the architects of their own destiny, navigating the treacherous waters of finance with nothing but their wits and a keen sense of opportunity. In the end, what truly set Roman bankers apart was their ability to see potential where others saw only risk. They were the eternal optimists of the economic world, forever seeking the next big opportunity, the next untapped market. Their story is one of ambition and audacity, a tale that continues to resonate in the corridors of power today. So the next time you find yourself crunching numbers or mulling over investment strategies, spare a thought for those ancient financiers who paved the way. They were the pioneers of a financial revolution, proving that even in the ancient world, money made the world go round. The Publicani and their ilk may have been the unsung heroes of Rome's economic might, but their legacy is a reminder that, when it comes to banking, some things never change. As the Roman Empire stretched its limbs across 3 continents, it inadvertently set the stage for the grand finale of its banking system. Transitioning from a robust economy to one plagued by instability, this decline mirrored the broader economic woes that would make any Roman banker reach for the nearest amphora of wine. The tale of Roman banking's downfall isn't just a story of coins and ledgers. It's a cautionary epic of inflation, debased currency, and political chaos. An ancient soap opera with less toga and more turmoil. Let's start with inflation, a headache as old as the empire itself. Inflation in Rome wasn't the gradual creep we're used to today. It was more like a chariot race, accelerating at a pace that left many clutching their money bags in disbelief. The culprit, debased coinage. Unlike today's digital currency, Roman money was very much the real deal, metal you could jingle in your toga pocket. But the trick was, the metal itself held intrinsic value. Enter the emperors, with their penchant for funding lavish games and endless wars, who decided to stretch their budget by sneaking less silver into the coins. Over time, a denarius wasn't worth its weight in silver because, well, it hardly had any left. This sneaky tactic, akin to watering down your wine and calling it vintage, led to a loss of trust in the currency. As the silver content plummeted, prices soared. By the time of Diocletian, who ruled from 284 to 305 CE, inflation was so rampant that it could make a Roman merchant's head spin faster than a discus at the Olympics. Diocletian tried to stem the tide by instituting the edict on maximum prices in 301 CE, an ancient attempt at price controls. Spoiler alert, it was about as successful as a lead balloon. Merchants simply ignored it, or worse, hoarded goods, exacerbating shortages and fueling the inflation beast. But it wasn't just the coins that were losing their shine. The political landscape was tarnishing as well. Rome was no stranger to political instability, but the 3rd century CE was a particularly rough patch. They called it the crisis of the 3rd century for a reason, folks. This was a time when the throne had more turnover than a fast food joint. Between 235 and 284 CE, over 20 emperors claimed the title, some ruling for months, others for days. The chaos disrupted trade routes, and the once thriving economy began to look more like a battlefield, both literally and figuratively. To add to the drama, the military was more involved in politics than ever. Soldiers were often the kingmakers, and emperors spent lavishly to keep the legions loyal. But loyalty bought with coin is as fickle as the Roman weather. The financial strain of maintaining a sprawling empire with a restless army put additional pressure on an already creaking economic system. The money needed for defense wasn't just coming from a communal part. It was being squeezed from a shrinking economy, amplifying the stress on the banking sector. Now, let's not forget the little guy in this grand narrative. The average Roman, whether a farmer in the provinces or a merchant in the Forum, wasn't immune to these macroeconomic tremors. With inflation eroding savings and political uncertainty unsettling markets, trust in financial institutions waned. The Argentarii, once the rock stars of the Forum, found themselves navigating a sea of economic turmoil with a sinking ship of public confidence. Loans defaulted, debts went unpaid, and the informal banking system that had sustained Rome's growth began to falter. And then there were the barbarian invasions. As if economic woes and political chaos weren't enough, Rome found itself fending off increasingly frequent incursions from Goths, Vandals, and other so-called barbarians. These invasions disrupted trade and further strained the empire's resources. The costs of defense skyrocketed, while the spoils of war, once a reliable source of revenue, dwindled. It was the ancient world's equivalent of a triple whammy: economic, political, and military crises converging in a perfect storm. In this turbulent landscape, the romanticized image of Roman prosperity starts to crumble. The empire, once a beacon of economic innovation, was now grappling with the harsh realities of sustaining its vast territories. The banking system, which had evolved to support expansion and opulence, was ill-equipped to handle contraction and scarcity. The allure of Rome's golden age was fading, replaced by a gritty struggle to maintain stability in a world that seemed intent on unraveling. But let's not get too carried away with the gloom. Even in the face of decline, there were those who adapted, finding opportunity amidst chaos. The wealthy elite, ever resourceful, shifted investments from currency to land, a more stable asset in uncertain times. It was a savvy move, akin to modern investors flocking to gold in a financial downturn. This shift underscored a crucial lesson. In times of crisis, those who adapt survive. Yet, for all its adaptability, the Roman banking system ultimately couldn't withstand the cumulative pressures of inflation, political instability, and external threats. It's a potent reminder of how interconnected economic and political systems are, and how the collapse of one can precipitate the decline of the other. The story of Roman banking is not just a tale of financial mechanics. It's a narrative of resilience and vulnerability, a reflection of an empire grappling with its own mortality. So, as we pause in our journey through Rome's financial history, let's consider the lessons it offers. The decline of the Roman banking system is a testament to the fragility of even the most robust economies when faced with unchecked inflation, political upheaval, and external threats. It's a sobering reminder that prosperity can be as ephemeral as the flickering flame of a Roman oil lamp. As we look to the final chapter of this saga, we'll explore how these forces shaped the legacy of Roman finance, setting the stage for the economic landscapes that followed. Stay tuned, because if history teaches us anything, it's that the story is far from over. And so, the curtain falls on Rome's financial drama, a saga of silver-laden triumphs and coin-toss disasters. But before we let the dust of history settle, let's chew over how this ancient financial world left its fingerprints on the modern money maze. The Romans, with their mix of brilliance and bedlam, didn't just lay down roads. They paved the way for a financial empire, too, one that echoes through today's digital corridors. The Argentarii, those swaggering silver men, may have vanished into the annals of history, but their legacy is the beating heart of our banking systems. Their open-air transactions in the buzzing Forum Romanum were precursors to today's transparent markets. Okay, maybe not as polished as the New York Stock Exchange, but the idea of transactions being a public affair, where everyone could witness and participate, has a certain democratic charm. This was banking for the people, by the people, in its rawest form. And speaking of transparency, let's tip our hats to the Roman innovation of the nomen, the precursor to the modern IOU or the more sophisticated banknote. These were essentially paper promises, a concept that has matured into the complex world of credit we know today. The Romans were pioneering in their attempts to create fluidity in transactions, ensuring that a sack of coins didn't weigh down every business deal. Let's face it, lugging around a purse full of denarii would make today's pocket change feel like a breeze. Then there were the syngraphi, those early contracts that became the backbone of Roman commerce. They were a leap towards the legal infrastructure we rely on today to make financial systems tick smoothly, or at least as smoothly as a bureaucracy can manage. The idea of having written agreements to safeguard transactions was revolutionary in a world where a handshake could be as slippery as an eel. Sure, forgery was rampant, and disputes often ended in court. But isn't that just a prelude to today's legal battles over contract breaches? Let's not forget the Publicani, those tax-collecting maestros who, despite their unsavory methods, showcased the potential of outsourcing. They proved that private enterprise could partner with the state to achieve economic goals, a notion that resonates in today's public-private partnerships. Of course, the Publicani's penchant for pushing ethical boundaries also serves as a cautionary tale, echoing in modern stories of corporate excess and lobbying scandals. It's a reminder that the line between innovation and exploitation can be as thin as a denarius. And then there's the small matter of interest rates. The Romans may have been the original loan sharks, with rates soaring to 12% or more, but their willingness to play fast and loose with credit laid the foundation for a world where borrowing and lending are the lifeblood of economic growth. Their audacious interest rates might have made today's payday lenders blush, but they also highlighted the inherent risk-reward calculus that underpins modern finance. When you think about it, the Roman economy was just one giant startup, fueled by ambition and a healthy disregard for risk. But let's not get too misty-eyed. The Romans also left us a legacy of economic cautionary tales that are as relevant today as they were 2 millennia ago. Take inflation, for example. The debasement of their currency in a bid to fund an empire's excesses mirrors the pitfalls faced by governments today when fiscal policies run amok. It's a sobering reminder that when you start tinkering with the money supply, you better have a plan more robust than cross your fingers and hope for the best. And political instability. The Romans were masters of that particular circus act. Their revolving door of emperors, each with their own fiscal agenda, is a stark warning of how political uncertainty can send economic systems into a tailspin. It's a timeless lesson that stability and confidence are the bedrock of any thriving economy. When the political landscape is more volatile than a Roman chariot race, investors tend to clutch their purses a little tighter. Yet, for all their missteps, the Romans were pioneers in the art of financial audacity. They dared to dream big, to expand their economic horizons, and in doing so, they left a blueprint for the modern world. Their innovations in banking, their attempts at legalizing transactions, and even their fiscal mistakes have all contributed to the financial tapestry we navigate today. It's a testament to human ingenuity and the unyielding pursuit of progress, even in the face of chaos. In the end, the story of Roman banking is one of ambition, risk, and the eternal quest for economic dominance. It's a narrative that resonates through the ages, a reminder that while the tools and technologies may evolve, the fundamental principles of finance remain unchanged. Money still makes the world go round, and the lessons of Rome continue to guide us, whether we're trading in denarii or digital currencies. So, as we close the book on this chapter of antiquity, let's raise a metaphorical glass to the Roman bankers, those trailblazers of financial history. They were the architects of a legacy that endures, a reminder that even in the ancient world, the dance of commerce was as intricate and compelling as it is today. Their story is a mirror reflecting our own economic adventures with all their triumphs and tribulations. And as we grapple with our own financial futures, it's comforting to know that we're not the first to walk this path, nor will we be the last. Here's to the Romans and their enduring influence, a testament to the timeless nature of human enterprise and the ever-spinning wheel of fortune. In the bustling, chaotic world of late 17th century Russia, young Peter Romanov's life was a whirlwind of tumult and ambition. Imagine being a 10-year-old kid with the weight of an empire dangling precariously over your head, ready to fall at any moment. Welcome to Peter's chaotic childhood, where power struggles were the family game, and surviving wasn't just a pastime, it was a necessity. Picture the scene. It's 1682, and the Streltsy, Moscow's elite guard, are having a bit of a hissy fit. And by hissy fit, I mean they're storming the Kremlin, leaving a trail of chaos and corpses behind them. These guys aren't just disgruntled employees. They're armed, irritable, and have a fondness for coups. Young Peter, just 10 at the time, witnessed this violent uprising firsthand. The Streltsy rebellion was essentially a medieval version of a really bad office party gone wrong, where the only way to get out alive was to avoid eye contact and hope for the best. This rebellion wasn't just some medieval drama. No, it shaped Peter's psyche in a big way. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, or in Peter's case, makes you obsessed with military reform. But let's not jump the gun. Before he could become the reformist Tsar we all know and, well, tolerate, Peter had to survive his childhood. His family was the Romanov edition of Game of Thrones, minus the dragons, but with just as much political intrigue and backstabbing. You see, Peter wasn't supposed to rule alone. He was declared co-Tsar with his half-brother Ivan V, a political compromise as stable as a unicycle on a tightrope. As a child, Peter was more like the kid who couldn't sit still in class. While other royals were probably learning how to wave from balconies or mastering the art of looking bored in portraits, Peter had a different hobby: ships. Yep, the boy was absolutely bonkers about boats. He wasn't content with just playing around with toy ships in the bath. He wanted the real deal. So he built a small, real-life fleet on a lake near Moscow. Not your typical childhood project. But then again, Peter wasn't your typical child. This fascination with ships wasn't just a quirky hobby. It was the seed of Peter's lifelong obsession with transforming Russia into a maritime power. Russia, at the time, was as landlocked as a country could get, with no warm water ports. Peter had big dreams of sailing the high seas, but first he needed to learn the ropes, quite literally. He didn't just sit back and let others do the dirty work. Nope, Peter was a hands-on kind of guy. He got down to the nitty-gritty, learning shipbuilding from the ground up, often mingling with foreign experts and craftsmen. Imagine a future Tsar rolling up his sleeves and getting his hands dirty. Not exactly the royal image, but definitely Peter's style. Peter's approach to learning was as unconventional as it was effective. He didn't just bellow orders from a throne, he learned by doing. This was a guy who thought nothing of putting on a disguise and hanging out in shipyards, absorbing knowledge like a sponge. He wasn't above getting his hands dirty, and that humility set him apart from many of his contemporaries. But of course, humility only goes so far when you have an empire to run. In his early attempts at military reform, Peter faced a challenge bigger than any ship he could build. The Russian army was, to put it mildly, a disorganized mess. It was the kind of military that would lose a game of Risk to a half-asleep toddler. Peter knew he had his work cut out for him, so he started with the basics: training, discipline, and organization. He borrowed ideas from the best European armies, bringing in foreign experts to teach his troops how not to embarrass themselves on the battlefield. Peter's military reforms were driven by a mix of necessity and pragmatism. He understood that if Russia was to stand toe-to-toe with European powers, it needed an army that didn't look like it was assembled at the last minute. The reforms were extensive, covering everything from drill practices to uniforms and weaponry. And while the results weren't immediate, they laid the groundwork for the formidable force that would later win Peter his great moniker. Despite his serious ambitions, Peter's antics were legendary. He was known for his towering height, his booming voice, and a penchant for practical jokes that would make even the most seasoned prankster blush. In one infamous incident, he reportedly arranged a mock wedding between a dwarf and a giantess. The bizarre spectacle was all in good fun, showcasing Peter's dark sense of humor. His court was as much a place of reform as it was of revelry. Imagine a frat house with imperial trimmings, and you're halfway there. Peter's early years were a curious blend of chaos and creativity. He was a man on a mission, determined to drag Russia kicking and screaming into the modern age. Through shipbuilding and military reform, he laid the foundational stones for his future exploits. But for now, he was a young Tsar in the making, learning the ropes of leadership in a world that was as unpredictable as his own ambitions. In the end, Peter's early life was a testament to his resilience, ingenuity, and vision. From surviving the Streltsy uprising to indulging in his love for ships, he was setting the stage for his reign. And while his antics might have raised a few eyebrows, they were all part of his larger-than-life persona. Peter the Great was a ruler who didn't follow the script. He wrote his own, and history would never be quite the same again. Peter the Great, now equipped with a taste for reform and a penchant for turning chaos into opportunity, wasn't content with just reshaping Russia from the inside. No, Peter had bigger fish to fry. European-sized fish. In 1697, he embarked on what would become a legendary European tour known as the Grand Embassy. This was no ordinary journey with a few cronies and a travel brochure. Peter set out with an entourage of 250 people, Imagine the logistics of dragging that many folks across Europe without the convenience of Expedia. The mission: to seek allies, learn the secrets of shipbuilding, and bring back the technological goodies he needed to drag Russia into the modern age. Now, if you think Peter was going to announce his arrival with trumpets and fanfare, think again. This was a guy who loved a bit of dress-up, and he decided to travel incognito. He adopted the alias Sergeant Pyotr Mikhailov, a humble officer among many. Pretty sneaky for a 6'8" Tsar whose face was probably on every Russian ruble. But Peter wasn't just playing dress-up for giggles. By observing Europe without the pomp of royalty, he could learn directly from the experts and avoid the diplomatic hoopla that usually came with his rank. Let's talk about Peter's first stop, the Netherlands. If Peter had a Tinder profile, it would say, loves long walks on shipyards and getting lost in the intricacies of naval architecture. The Dutch were the rock stars of shipbuilding at the time, and Peter was a starstruck fan. Amsterdam's docks were like Disneyland for him, except instead of Mickey Mouse, there were craftsmen, shipwrights, and mariners who knew the secrets of the sea. Peter was like a kid in a candy store, except this candy was the kind that could float and fire cannons. He rolled up his sleeves and got to work, learning everything from carpentry to navigation. Imagine a reigning monarch hammering away at a hull alongside shipbuilders. Talk about hands-on leadership. Peter wasn't just about the manual labor, though. He soaked up Western technology like a sponge, from the small stuff, like tools and techniques, to the big-picture strategies that made the Dutch maritime juggernauts. He paid particular attention to the art of ship design and construction, which he believed held the key to Russia's future naval dominance. The Dutch, known for their efficiency, were probably scratching their heads at this Russian giant, eager to learn from the ground up. But Peter was serious. He even paid for his own lessons, which was probably a refreshing change for the working men used to nobles demanding freebies. But the Grand Embassy wasn't all smooth sailing. Peter's incognito adventures had their fair share of absurdities. Picture him at a party in England, where he reportedly attempted to yank out a guest's teeth with a pair of pliers, just for fun. Not exactly the kind of party trick you'd expect from European royalty, but hey, it was Peter's world. He also managed to demolish part of the house he was staying in, leaving a path of destruction that probably had the local insurers tearing their hair out. Despite the occasional mishap, Peter's curiosity knew no bounds. He ventured into England and studied their military tactics and shipyards, keen to understand the industrial and naval prowess that made the English a force to be reckoned with. He even visited the Royal Observatory at Greenwich, where he was fascinated by astronomical instruments, probably dreaming of celestial navigation that could guide his future fleet. It was a whirlwind tour of learning, experimentation, and, of course, a bit of chaos. Peter's European escapade was a masterclass in cultural exchange, but it wasn't all Western admiration and nifty gadgets. The Grand Embassy was also a diplomatic mission with a side of espionage. Peter was on the lookout for allies against the Ottoman Empire, hoping to bolster Russia's position in the endless game of geopolitical chess. He was also keenly aware of how far behind Russia was in terms of technology and infrastructure. Western Europe was like a high-speed train, and Russia was still hitching its horses. Throughout the journey, Peter sent back crates of ship models, blueprints, and materials to Russia, determined to replicate the magic at home. It was a logistical nightmare, but a testament to his commitment to transforming Russia. The man was relentless, and his sheer determination was both inspiring and slightly terrifying. Can you imagine the customs declarations on those shipments? The Grand Embassy was a turning point, not just for Peter, but for Russia as a whole. It set the stage for the sweeping reforms that would follow, laying the groundwork for a nation poised to elbow its way onto the European stage. But the journey itself was a spectacle of contrasts. A Tsar in disguise, Western marvels, and a series of blunders that highlighted Peter's human side amidst his imperial ambitions. As Peter returned to Russia, he wasn't just lugging back souvenirs and stories. He was bringing a new vision. The Tsar who had set out in disguise had learned the ropes, literally and metaphorically. He had seen the future in the bustling shipyards of the Netherlands, the disciplined armies of Europe, and the technological wonders that defined the age. Peter was ready to roll up his sleeves and start a revolution at home, armed with the knowledge that would reshape an empire. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Peter's adventures in Europe were just the beginning. His return would mark the start of an era of reform that would shake Russia to its core, but that's another story for another time. For now, let's wrap up our European escapade with this. When it came to ambition, Peter the Great wasn't just playing dress-up, he was rewriting the rules of the game. And history, as they say, would never be the same. So, Peter the Great is back in Russia, fresh from his European escapade, armed with more ideas than a Silicon Valley startup. But instead of discussing apps, he's about to give Russia a makeover so drastic that even the staunchest traditionalists would clutch their beards in horror. And speaking of beards, let's start with one of Peter's most infamous reforms, the beard tax. Yep, you heard that right. If you wanted facial hair, you had to pay for the privilege. Picture this, 1698 Russia, a place where beards were not just a fashion statement but a holy mandate. For centuries, Russian men revered their facial hair as sacred, a symbol of orthodox piety and masculinity. Now, along comes Peter, fresh off the European runway, declaring that if Russia was to join the modern world, it needed a clean-shaven look. The beard tax was a statement as much as a fiscal tool. It was Peter's not-so-subtle way of saying, get with the times, or get out your wallets. The tax itself wasn't merely symbolic. Depending on your social status, you paid anywhere from 2 kopecks to 100 rubles a year to keep that chin fuzz. For context, 100 rubles was a small fortune, enough to buy a good-sized plot of land. Imagine the uproar. In a society where beards were practically a birthright, this was like demanding cowboys trade in their boots for loafers. Some complied. Others tucked their beards into their clothes, hoping to dodge the beard police. But don't mistake this for an extravagant whim. Peter's reforms were all about economic practicality and control. By imposing the beard tax, he was nudging Russia closer to European customs and simultaneously filling the state coffers. It was a 2-for-1 deal. Modernize the populace and boost the treasury. Yet, for many Russians, this was the ultimate slap in the beard. They saw it as Peter's assault on their identity, a tug-of-war between tradition and progress. And the beard tax was just the tip of the iceberg. Peter's vision for modern Russia wasn't limited to facial hair. He had grand plans for everything from the military to the bureaucracy. He wanted to turn Russia from a medieval relic into a European powerhouse, and he was about to drag it, kicking and occasionally screaming, into the 18th century. Let's dive into his bureaucratic overhaul, a move that was as ambitious as it was chaotic. Before Peter, the Russian administrative system was about as organized as a sock drawer after a toddler's been through it. Corruption was rampant, inefficiency was the norm, and the system seemed designed to confuse and frustrate. Enter Peter with his ambition to streamline and centralize. He established a series of colleges, not the kind with dorms and keg parties, that were essentially government departments, each responsible for a specific area like foreign affairs, war, and commerce. Peter's bureaucratic reforms were inspired by the Swedish model, which was known for its efficiency and accountability. He wanted an administrative machine that ran like clockwork, not a Rube Goldberg contraption powered by vodka and bribes. The new system required officials to be educated and competent, a radical concept for the time. He even sent young nobles abroad to learn the ropes of modern governance, aiming to cultivate a new class of bureaucrats who understood the value of order and discipline. Yet, as you might guess, the transition wasn't exactly smooth. The old guard didn't take kindly to Peter's meddling. They saw his reforms as an affront to their established way of life, and resistance was fierce. The backlash was both comical and tragic. Officials concocted elaborate schemes to bypass the new regulations and continue their old ways. Imagine trying to install a high-tech security system in a building that's already half demolished and full of loopholes. That was Peter's Russia in a nutshell. Despite the resistance, Peter's reforms laid the groundwork for a more effective government. He understood that for Russia to be taken seriously on the world stage, it needed a bureaucracy that didn't look like it was run by a bunch of medieval jesters. The reforms were a long game, and while the initial results were mixed, they set Russia on a path towards modernization. But let's not sugarcoat it. These reforms came at a cost. For many Russians, Peter's changes were a bitter pill. They saw a leader who was so eager to embrace the West that he was willing to trample over Russian traditions. The social fabric was stretched thin, and the tension between old and new simmered beneath the surface. Amidst this cultural tug-of-war, Peter was relentless. His drive to modernize was not just an obsession, but a necessity. He knew that Russia, with its vast land and resources, had the potential to be a major player on the global stage. But first, it needed a makeover, one that involved not just shaving beards but reshaping minds. And if that required a little forceful persuasion, so be it. Peter's quest for modernization was nothing short of a roller coaster, with highs that soared and lows that plummeted. Yet, through it all, his vision never wavered. He was determined to craft a Russia that could stand toe-to-toe with the great powers of Europe, even if it meant stepping on a few toes or beards along the way. As the dust settled and the reforms took root, Peter's legacy began to take shape. He was a ruler who didn't just govern, he transformed. And while the Russia he left behind was far from perfect, it was undeniably changed, ready to face a new century with a new identity. But hold on, because we're not done yet. There's more to Peter's story, and the next chapter is just around the corner. Stay tuned, because this Russian saga is far from over. Peter's saga of transformation was far from over. If you thought the beard tax and bureaucratic shake-up were bold, just wait for his next act, the Great Northern War. This wasn't just some skirmish with a neighbor over a misplaced fence. It was an epic showdown that would last over 2 decades. Picture this, 1700, a year synonymous with the kickoff of a conflict that would redefine Northern Europe. Our protagonist, Peter, was eyeing the Baltic Sea like a kid staring at the last slice of pizza at a party. He wasn't just after a beachside vacation. He was aiming to break Sweden's stranglehold on the region and secure Russia's access to the sea. Now, Peter wasn't exactly up against pushovers. Sweden, led by the young and formidable King Charles Roman XII, was the military equivalent of a well-oiled machine. Think of them as the Avengers of 18th-century Scandinavia, small in number, but packing a serious punch. But Peter was not one to back down. Armed with his newly reformed army, he set out to turn the tide and make Russia a maritime power. The war officially kicked off when Peter, alongside his allies, declared war on Sweden. The initial battles were more of a slapstick comedy than a strategic masterclass, with Peter's forces suffering crushing defeats, including the disastrous Battle of Narva in 1700. It was a wake-up call that screamed, "Hey, Peter, you might want to rethink that battle plan." But if there's one thing Peter was good at, it was learning from failure. He regrouped, rearmed, and rethought his strategy. He transformed his army, drilling them to near exhaustion until they could march like clockwork. Numbers became his friend. By 1709, Peter had built a force of 100,000 men, a staggering number compared to Sweden's 40,000. He wasn't just throwing bodies at the problem. He was creating an organized, disciplined machine ready to take on Charles's troops. The Great Northern War wasn't just fought with muskets and bayonets. It was a battle of wits, logistics, and resources. Peter understood the importance of supply lines, infrastructure, and, most importantly, morale. He turned to Western Europe for inspiration, incorporating modern techniques in training and armament. His troops were equipped with the latest flintlock muskets and artillery, making them a force to be reckoned with. The tide began to turn at the Battle of Poltava in 1709, a clash that would cement Peter's reputation as a military leader. It was here that Peter's strategic brilliance shone. While Charles Roman XII was recovering from an injury, Peter seized the opportunity to strike. His forces surrounded the Swedish camp, creating a choke point that would become Sweden's undoing. The battle was a decisive victory for Russia, marking the beginning of the end for Sweden's dominance in the region. It was a moment that had Peter's detractors scratching their heads, wondering how the Tsar who once fumbled at Narva had pulled off such a feat. Yet, Peter's ambitions didn't stop at military victories. He had a vision, a grand vision of a city that would serve as Russia's window to Europe. Enter St. Petersburg, a city born from Peter's relentless ambition. Founded in 1703, this wasn't just any city. It was a symbol of Peter's aspirations, a testament to Russia's rise as a European power. But let's not sugarcoat it. The founding of St. Petersburg was more of a Herculean task than a fairy tale. The location Peter chose for his new capital was, to put it mildly, a nightmare. The swampy, inhospitable terrain of the Neva River Delta was about as welcoming as a Siberian winter. But Peter saw potential where others saw a bog. He envisioned a city that would rival the great European capitals, a hub of commerce and culture. And so, with typical Peter flair, he ordered the construction of St. Petersburg, from hell or high water, literally. The human cost of Peter's dream was staggering. Tens of thousands of Russian peasants and serfs were conscripted to build the city, often without proper tools or shelter. The conditions were brutal, with disease and exhaustion claiming countless lives. Estimates suggest that between 25,000 and 100,000 workers perished during the city's construction, a grim testament to the price of Peter's ambition. It was a dark chapter, often glossed over in romanticized tales of Russia's rise, but one that underscored the harsh reality of imperial dreams. Despite the human toll, St. Petersburg rose from the marshes like a phoenix. By 1712, it had become the capital of Russia, a glittering jewel of Baroque architecture and grand boulevards. It was a city of contrasts, elegant palaces and bustling shipyards, a cosmopolitan center that drew in artists, scholars, and merchants from across Europe. For Peter, it was a triumph, a tangible manifestation of his vision to propel Russia into the European fold. But St. Petersburg was more than just a city. It was a statement. It embodied Peter's belief in the power of transformation, his conviction that Russia's destiny lay in the West. This wasn't just about geography. It was about ideology. St. Petersburg was a cultural and political pivot, a declaration that Russia was no longer content to linger on the fringes of Europe. Yet, for all its grandeur, St. Petersburg was a city built on sacrifice. It was a stark reminder that progress often comes at a cost, and that cost was paid in sweat, blood, and lives. Peter's legacy was one of ambition and achievement, but also of hardship and human suffering. It was a complex tapestry, woven with threads of triumph and tragedy. As the Great Northern War dragged on, Peter continued to consolidate his gains. His victory at Poltava had shifted the balance of power, and by 1721, the Treaty of Nystad officially ended the war, sealing Russia's status as a major European power. The treaty granted Russia significant territorial gains, including access to the Baltic Sea, an achievement that would have been unthinkable just decades earlier. Peter's triumphs were not without their critics. His aggressive policies and relentless pursuit of modernization earned him as much disdain as admiration. To some, he was a visionary leader who dragged Russia into the modern age. To others, a tyrant who sacrificed his people on the altar of progress. It was a dichotomy that defined his reign, a testament to the complexity of leadership in an era of change. But if there's one thing to glean from Peter's story, it's that history is rarely black and white. It's a kaleidoscope of ambition and consequence, a dance of vision and reality. Peter the Great was a ruler who dared to dream big, who reshaped the landscape of his nation with a force of will that was both awe-inspiring and fearsome. His legacy is etched into the stones of St. Petersburg, a city that stands as a testament to his indomitable spirit and the enduring power of dreams. So as we leave Peter amidst the construction noise of his burgeoning capital, remember this. In the grand tapestry of history, few threads are woven without fraying. Peter's story is one of those rare threads, a tale of audacious ambition and the relentless pursuit of a new world. One brick, one battle, one beard at a time. The stage was set, the future was unfolding, and Russia was ready to step into the spotlight. But the tale of Peter's reign isn't done yet. The final act awaits, with more twists and turns in the story of a Tsar who never settled for anything less than greatness. Stay tuned for the next chapter. It's going to be a wild ride. Peter's story wasn't just about battles and beards. It was a tale of relentless ambition and the formidable toll it exacted on both the man and the nation he sought to transform. As we dive into Peter's later years, his legacy becomes a mosaic of triumph and tragedy, a testament to the complex dance between vision and reality that defined his reign. By the time the dust of the Great Northern War had settled, Peter was more than just a seasoned ruler. He was a man obsessed with legacy. His health, however, was starting to mirror the wear and tear of his relentless drive. Years of hard living, think endless banquets, vodka-fueled nights, and a penchant for hands-on work, had left him a physical wreck. By his late 40s, Peter was suffering from a litany of ailments, including urinary problems that would ultimately contribute to his demise. Not exactly the glamorous end you'd expect for a larger-than-life Tsar, but hey, nobody ever said history was fair. Peter, never one to rest on his laurels, pressed on with his final reforms, as if racing against time itself. He was a man with a checklist the size of Russia, and he was determined to tick off every item before the clock ran out. One of his last major projects was the reformation of the Russian Orthodox Church. Peter saw the church as an institution mired in medieval thinking, a relic that needed dragging into the modern age. So, in true Peter fashion, he abolished the Patriarchate and established the Holy Synod, a government body that would effectively bring the church under state control. It was a bold move, akin to telling the Pope to stick to Instagram quotes and leave the governance to the professionals. Naturally, it ruffled quite a few cassocks, but it solidified Peter's grip on power and aligned the church with his vision for a modern Russia. But let's not overlook the toll of Peter's unyielding ambition. His reforms, though transformative, often came at a steep human cost. His obsession with modernization sometimes bulldozed over the welfare of the very people he aimed to uplift. Take his notorious industrial push, for example. Peter was determined to kickstart Russia's economy, and he went about it with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. He established ironworks, shipyards, and factories, pushing Russia to become a self-sufficient industrial power. Yet, the workforce was largely composed of serfs and peasants, toiling under harsh conditions with minimal pay. It was an industrial revolution, Russian style, where progress was measured in sweat and suffering. Peter's policies, while visionary, often felt like a tightrope walk between innovation and despotism. His creation of the table of ranks, a system that allowed commoners to rise through the bureaucratic ranks based on merit rather than birth, was revolutionary for its time. It opened doors for talented individuals who would otherwise be shackled by their social status. Yet, this same system also entrenched a hierarchy that was rigid and unforgiving, a double-edged sword that served both as a ladder and a cage. As Peter's reign drew to a close, the myths surrounding him began to crystallize into legend. The man who had once roamed the shipyards in disguise, who had built a city from the swamps, and who had stared down the might of Sweden, was now an icon. But with icon status comes the inevitable embellishment of deeds and the glossing over of darker truths. Peter was hailed as a visionary who had dragged Russia into the modern world, yet he was also a tyrant whose methods were as brutal as they were effective. His legacy is a reminder that history is often written in shades of grey, not black and white. Reflecting on Peter's life, one can't help but marvel at the sheer audacity of his vision. He was a man who saw beyond the horizon, who dared to challenge the status quo with a ferocity that left both admirers and adversaries in awe. Yet, his relentless pursuit of greatness also serves as a cautionary tale. In his quest to reshape Russia, Peter often overlooked the human cost of his ambition, a blind spot that history cannot ignore. As we wrap up our journey through the life and times of Peter the Great, it's worth pondering the dual nature of his legacy. On one hand, he was the architect of a new Russia, a nation poised to play a pivotal role on the world stage. On the other, he was a ruler whose methods were as controversial as they were effective. His story is a testament to the power of vision, but also a reminder of the delicate balance between ambition and empathy. In the end, Peter was a man who wore many hats: reformer, autocrat, visionary, tyrant. His legacy is stitched into the very fabric of Russian history, a complex tapestry woven with threads of progress and pain. So as we close the chapter on Peter the Great, let's remember him not just as a figure of history, but as a man who dared to dream big, who reshaped a nation, and who left a legacy that continues to echo through the annals of time. History, after all, is a conversation between the past and the present, and Peter's story is one that will be whispered and debated for generations to come. Strap in, folks, because we're diving headfirst into the whirlwind early life of Catherine the Great, a woman who could out-scheme a chess grandmaster while wearing a corset and a powdered wig. Born Sophie Friederike August von Anhalt-Zerbst in 1729, in a place that sounds like a sneeze, Stettin, Prussia. She was about as far from Russian royalty as you could get, but this girl had ambition that could rival a reality TV contestant's hunger for screen time. Sophie was the daughter of a minor Prussian prince. Think of him as the equivalent of a regional manager in the grand hierarchy of European nobility. Her mom, Johanna, was determined to turn Sophie into something more than just another noblewoman lounging around in an uncomfortable gown. So, when the Russian Empress Elizabeth set her sights on finding a bride for her less-than-stellar nephew, Peter Ulrich of Holstein-Gardorp, Johanna saw opportunity knocking, and she answered with a battering ram. Now, Peter was no Prince Charming. In fact, he was more like Prince Awkward. Raised in the boondocks of Holstein, he was reportedly more interested in toy soldiers than real people. But hey, love is blind, or at least strategic alliances are. So, in 1744, Sophie packed her bags, kissed Stettin goodbye, and made the 500-kilometer trek to Russia, a land of snow, bears, and political intrigue. She was just 14 years old and already being thrown into the shark tank of 18th-century European politics. Upon arrival, Sophie did what any savvy newcomer would do. She rebranded. She converted to the Russian Orthodox faith, adopted the name Catherine, and learned Russian faster than you can say Tsar. Her language skills were so impressive that by 1745 she could converse fluently, leaving her new in-laws both impressed and slightly wary. If there had been an 18th-century version of Duolingo, Catherine would have been its poster child. Then came the marriage to Peter. It's safe to say their union was less a fairy tale and more a sitcom. Peter, who would later become Peter Roman III, was a quirky guy with a penchant for playing army games long past the age when it was cute. He once reportedly upset Catherine by hanging rats from the ceiling as part of his military exercises. Romantic, right? Despite these peculiarities, Catherine was no damsel in distress. She was determined to make the best of her situation, or more accurately, to make a lot more than the best. While Peter fiddled with his army toys, Catherine was busy reading Voltaire and Montesquieu, soaking up Enlightenment ideas like a sponge in a philosophy bath. She understood that knowledge was power, a currency even more valuable than the rubles jingling in the royal coffers. Her marriage to Peter might have been a farce, but Catherine was playing the long game. She knew that the Russian court was a place where allegiances could shift as quickly as the weather. So, she forged connections, charmed diplomats, and, like any good chess player, she was always thinking several moves ahead. While Peter alienated just about everyone with his erratic behavior, Catherine was winning hearts and minds with her intelligence and charm. The stakes were high. Russia in the mid-18th century was a sprawling empire, stretching across 22 million square kilometers, with a patchwork of ethnic groups and a political landscape as stable as a house of cards in a windstorm. Elizabeth's reign was marked by opulence and excess, but also by a court that was positively seething with intrigue. It was a place where a misstep could cost you not just favor, but potentially your head. Catherine navigated this environment like a pro, with a keen understanding that survival required more than just keeping up appearances. It required a shrewd mind and the ability to stay one step ahead of the game. She was playing a complex game of 3D chess while everyone else was still figuring out the rules of checkers. And so, Catherine bided her time. She survived the absurdity of her marriage, the chaos of the court, and the endless Russian winters, all while keeping her eyes firmly on the prize. She was determined not just to survive, but to thrive, and in time, to rule. The girl from Stettin was ready to become more than just a footnote in history. She was ready to write her own chapter, and it was going to be a bestseller. And so, Catherine sat poised at the edge of history, ready to leap into legend. But before she could trade in her royal footnote for a leading role, she had to deal with one tiny inconvenience: her husband, Peter Roman III. Now, if you've been paying attention, you'll remember Peter wasn't exactly the poster child for stable leadership. In fact, by 1762, Peter's bizarre antics were less quirky husband and more royal liability. Let's start with the fact that Peter's hobbies could fill an entire season of bizarre royal pastimes. When he wasn't staging mock battles with his toy soldiers, seriously, the guy had a collection that would make a modern-day action figure enthusiast blush. He was busy alienating just about everyone in the Russian court. Remember those rats he hung as part of his military exercises? Turns out, his oddball approach to leadership didn't stop there. Peter's policies were about as popular as a rainstorm at a picnic. He managed to offend the Russian Orthodox Church by flirting with Protestant reforms, a move that left the clergy clutching their cassocks in horror. And his admiration for Prussia. Yes, the same Prussia that was a traditional enemy of Russia. was about as wise as wearing a Go Team Prussia shirt to a Russian national holiday, not exactly a recipe for winning friends and influencing people. Meanwhile, Catherine was quietly assembling her own team, consisting of loyal supporters, disgruntled nobles, and a sprinkle of military muscle. Among her key allies was Grigory Orlov, a dashing officer with a jawline that could cut glass, and his equally impressive brothers. Together, they were like the Ocean's 11 of the Russian coup scene, minus the Vegas heist, and plus a lot more fur hats. Here's where things get juicy. Peter's reign lasted a grand total of 6 months. Yep, you blink, and you'd miss it. During that brief tenure, he managed to alienate the army, the church, and the nobility, turning his court into a who's who of disgruntled power players. The final straw came when Peter decided to ditch the Russian Orthodox Church's traditions for a Protestant-inspired overhaul. It was like replacing the vodka at a Russian wedding with sparkling water, unforgivable. In July of 1762, Catherine decided enough was enough. With the backing of the Orlov brothers and key military units, she made her move. Picture this: Catherine riding through the streets of St. Petersburg in full military regalia, rallying troops like a rock star on a world tour. And the crowd, they ate it up. By the time she reached the Winter Palace, she had the support of the powerful Izmailovsky regiment and the capital's populace. Peter, meanwhile, was off at his summer residence, Oranienbaum, probably playing with his toy soldiers or considering another ill-advised reform. News of Catherine's coup reached him like a splash of cold water, and he realized he'd been outmaneuvered. In a desperate attempt to salvage his reign, he issued a series of frantic orders, which were about as effective as shouting at the tide to stop coming in. With the writing on the wall, Peter abdicated on July 9, 1762. His reign, shorter than a Russian winter's day, was over. Catherine was officially proclaimed Empress, marking the beginning of a remarkable 34-year rule. The transition was so smooth that it was almost as if the universe had been rooting for her all along. But let's not romanticize this too much. The reality of Catherine's rise to power was a testament to her political acumen and understanding of Russian realpolitik. She knew exactly when to strike and how to wield alliances like a seasoned diplomat. Her coup was a masterclass in timing and strategy, executed with the precision of a military campaign and the flair of a theatrical production. Peter, on the other hand, wasn't quite ready to exit stage left. He was taken into custody and spirited away to Ropsha, a secluded estate outside St. Petersburg. Officially, he died of hemorrhoidal colic, a euphemism that sounds about as believable as the dog ate my homework. In reality, it's likely he was murdered, a casualty of the very power struggle he had unwittingly fueled. Catherine's ascension wasn't just a victory for her, it was a seismic shift in Russian politics. She had transformed from a foreign princess into the ruler of the largest empire on earth. Her story was no fairy tale, unless your idea of a fairy tale includes political intrigue, strategic marriages, and the occasional coup d'etat. As Catherine settled into her new role, she faced the daunting task of ruling an empire that spanned over 22 million square kilometers, from the icy shores of the Baltic to the steppes of Siberia. Her reign would be marked by ambition, reform, and the occasional scandal, but that's a story for another day. For now, Catherine had secured her place in history, and she was just getting started. With her crown barely settled on her head, and the ink from Peter's abdication still drying, Catherine the Great faced the daunting task of dragging Russia into the modern age, all while keeping her new empire's sprawling borders from unraveling like a poorly knit sweater. And let's be real, folks. Russia in the 18th century was a bit like a giant, unruly teenager in desperate need of a makeover. Enter Catherine, armed with the ideas of the Enlightenment and a determination to make Voltaire proud. Catherine's first order of business was to establish herself not just as a ruler, but as a ruler with a vision. Now, she could have just sat on her laurels and thrown lavish parties in the Winter Palace, but where's the fun in that? Instead, she took a page from the Enlightenment playbook and embarked on a mission to modernize her empire. Her secret weapon, a pen-pal relationship with none other than the intellectual heavyweights of the day, Voltaire and Diderot. Yes, Catherine was basically the 18th century equivalent of someone who slides into the DMs of their favorite philosopher. Her correspondence with Voltaire was the stuff of legend. They exchanged over 15 years' worth of letters, with Voltaire playing the role of enthusiastic cheerleader and Catherine as the star student. It's worth noting that by this time, Voltaire was essentially the Beyoncé of the Enlightenment, and his approval was like a golden ticket to the intellectual elite. Voltaire affectionately dubbed her the Star of the North, and Catherine, ever the savvy strategist, knew that such high praise was more than just flattery. It was political capital. But it wasn't all philosophical musings and high-minded ideals. Catherine faced the rather unglamorous task of implementing these ideas in a country where the literacy rate was about as low as a modern-day phone battery at 2%, not exactly conducive to Enlightenment thinking. To address this, she launched a series of education reforms that would make any overzealous school board member proud. She established the Smolny Institute in 1764, the first state-funded institution for the education of women in Russia. It was a bold move in a society where educating women was about as popular as wearing socks with sandals. Catherine's education reforms extended beyond the hallowed halls of Smolny. She pushed for the creation of a network of secular state schools, a radical departure from the church-run schools that had dominated Russian education. Her goal was to have a school in every provincial town, a dream that was ambitious to say the least, given the sheer size of Russia. After all, this was a land that stretched over 22 million square kilometers. It's like trying to convince a cat to take a bath. You may have the best intentions, but the execution is a whole different story. Of course, the reality of implementing these reforms was a bit of a comedy of errors. There was the small issue of finding qualified teachers, a task akin to searching for a needle in a particularly large haystack. And then there was the challenge of getting students to actually attend these new schools. You see, many Russian peasants were more interested in keeping their children at home to help with the harvest than sending them off to learn about geometry and grammar. Can you blame them? For a peasant family, every extra pair of hands was crucial to survival. But Catherine was nothing if not persistent. She was determined to elevate the intellectual level of her subjects, even if it meant battling against centuries of ignorance and inertia. And while her education reforms were a mixed bag of successes and setbacks, they laid the groundwork for future generations. Her efforts were like planting seeds in the frozen Russian soil. Some would sprout and grow, while others would remain dormant, waiting for a warmer climate. Meanwhile, Catherine's flirtation with the Enlightenment ideals wasn't limited to education. She sought to reform the legal system, which was, to put it kindly, a bit of a hot mess. Russian law at the time was a patchwork of outdated codes and arbitrary decrees, a bureaucratic nightmare that even Kafka would find excessive. In 1767, Catherine convened the Legislative Commission, a grand assembly that brought together representatives from across her empire to draft a new code of laws. The commission was a veritable Noah's Ark of Russian society, with nobles, townspeople, and even Cossacks all crammed together, trying to hash out a legal framework for the nation. Catherine herself penned the nakaz, or instruction, a groundbreaking document that drew heavily from Montesquieu's, the spirit of the laws and Beccaria's, on crimes and punishments. The nakaz was a bold statement of Enlightenment principles, advocating for the elimination of torture and capital punishment and championing the idea of equality before the law. It was as if Catherine had taken the greatest hits of Enlightenment thought and compiled them into a legal manifesto. But, as with many great ideas, the reality was a bit of a letdown. The Legislative Commission turned out to be more talk than action, a cacophony of competing interests and regional rivalries that made progress about as likely as a snowstorm in July. The nakaz, though admired by intellectuals across Europe, was largely ignored by the Commission, which disbanded without producing a single piece of legislation. It was a classic case of all sizzle and no steak. Still, Catherine's efforts were not in vain. Even if the Commission failed to deliver concrete results, it was a symbolic gesture that demonstrated her commitment to reform. And let's not forget, Catherine was playing the long game. She understood that change, especially in a country as vast and complex as Russia, was a marathon, not a sprint. Her reign was a balancing act between ambition and pragmatism, between the lofty ideals of the Enlightenment and the gritty realities of Russian governance. While Catherine was busy attempting to overhaul the legal system and boost education. She also kept a close eye on the economy. Russia's economy at the time was like a precarious house of cards, heavily reliant on serfdom and agriculture, with little in the way of industrial development. Catherine, ever the reformer, sought to diversify the economy and encourage trade. She established new cities and encouraged the development of industries, from textiles to mining. Her goal was to transform Russia into an economic powerhouse, though the results were mixed at best. One of her notable achievements was the expansion of trade with Europe and Asia, as she opened up new ports and negotiated trade agreements that would make any modern-day trade envoy proud. But despite these efforts, Russia's economy remained largely agrarian, with serfdom continuing to be a major obstacle to progress. Catherine's attempts to address the issue of serfdom were complicated by the fact that the nobility, who held the real power in the countryside, were fiercely protective of their rights and privileges. It was like trying to convince a kid to give up their Halloween candy, an uphill battle with little hope of success. And then there was the Pugachev Rebellion of 1773-1775, a peasant uprising that threatened to derail Catherine's reform efforts altogether, led by the charismatic and slightly unhinged Yemelyan Pugachev, who claimed to be Peter Roman III back from the dead. The rebellion spread like wildfire across the Russian heartland. It was a stark reminder of the deep-seated discontent simmering beneath the surface of Russian society, a powder keg waiting to explode. Catherine eventually crushed the rebellion with a mix of military might and strategic concessions, but the uprising left a lasting impact on her reign. It highlighted the limitations of her reforms and the challenges of governing a vast and diverse empire. It was a wake-up call that underscored the need for caution and compromise, even as she pursued her ambitious agenda. As Catherine continued to navigate the treacherous waters of Russian politics, she remained steadfast in her commitment to Enlightenment ideals. She was a ruler who understood the power of ideas, even as she grappled with the realities of implementing them in a land that often seemed resistant to change. Her reign was a testament to the complexities of leadership, a delicate dance between vision and reality, between progress and tradition. And so, Catherine the Great pressed on, determined to leave her mark on history. Her story was far from over, and the challenges she faced would test her resolve and ingenuity in ways she could scarcely imagine. But for now, she remained the star of the North, a beacon of enlightenment in a world still shrouded in darkness, poised to continue her quest to transform Russia from within. As Catherine the Great continued her reign, she wasn't just content with playing the role of the Enlightenment's darling in Russia's domestic affairs. No, Catherine had her eyes set on a grander stage, the sprawling world of foreign policy and territorial expansion. It was like she had a giant risk board in front of her, and she was determined to paint as many territories as possible in Russian colors. But let's not kid ourselves. This wasn't just about coloring maps. It was about power, prestige, and positioning Russia as a major player on the global chessboard. Catherine's expansionist strategies were nothing short of ambitious. She saw the Ottoman Empire as both a threat and an opportunity, a kind of frenemy situation that would make any modern diplomat's head spin. The Russo-Turkish Wars, which she led Russia through from 1768 to 1774, and again from 1787 to 1792, were not just about territorial gains, but also about asserting Russian dominance in Eastern Europe and the Black Sea region. Think of it as Catherine's way of saying, Russia has arrived, and it's here to stay. During these conflicts, Catherine's military campaigns were as carefully calculated as one of her philosophical debates. The Treaty of Kusuk-Kainaka in 1774, which concluded the First War, was a coup for Russia. It granted them access to the Black Sea, a warm water port, a geostrategic jackpot for a nation often iced out of year-round maritime trade. In addition, Crimea became independent from the Ottomans, only to be annexed by Russia in 1783, further expanding Catherine's empire. This was no small feat. The annexation added about 26,000 square kilometers to the empire's already vast territory. Now, it's tempting to imagine Catherine personally leading the charge, sword in hand, like some 18th-century action hero. But in reality, she was more like a master puppeteer, pulling the strings from afar. Her generals, such as Pyotr Rumyantsev and Grigory Potemkin, were the ones getting their boots dirty, while Catherine provided the vision and the political savvy to make it all possible. It's a bit like crediting the conductor for a symphony, even though they're not playing a single instrument. Of course, with great expansion came great responsibility and significant costs. War is expensive, and Catherine's campaigns were no exception. The Russo-Turkish wars drained the Russian treasury, racking up costs that would make even the most extravagant royal blush. By some estimates, these conflicts cost Russia over 100 million rubles, a staggering figure when you consider that the empire's annual revenue at the time was around 50 million rubles. It's the kind of budget overrun that would send any modern finance minister into a cold sweat. And then there's the human cost. War may be a game of thrones for monarchs, but for the soldiers and civilians caught in its wake, it's a brutal reality. Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers perished in these conflicts, and countless more were wounded or left destitute. The toll on the civilian population was equally grim, with entire communities upended by the ravages of war. It's a stark reminder that while the maps may change color, the human cost remains a constant. Yet, despite these harsh realities, the myth surrounding Catherine's military prowess persisted. Tales of her strategic brilliance and military acumen were circulated like juicy court gossip, painting her as a warrior empress who could rival the likes of Alexander the Great. It's the kind of narrative that appeals to our love of larger-than-life figures, even if the truth is a bit more mundane. Catherine was indeed a remarkable leader, but her real genius lay in her ability to delegate and inspire, not in leading cavalry charges. Beyond the Ottoman front, Catherine's gaze swept northward to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a region that at the time was about as stable as a house of cards in a wind tunnel. The partitions of Poland, executed in 3 acts between 1772 and 1795, were a masterclass in diplomatic maneuvering and strategic opportunism. By the end of it, Russia had gobbled up a whopping 462,000 square kilometers of Polish territory. It was like watching a lioness slowly dismember her prey, piece by piece, until nothing was left but scraps. In these partitions, Catherine was not alone. She collaborated with Prussia and Austria, each taking their own slice of the Polish pie. It was a real estate deal writ large, with entire nations doing the kind of carve-up that would make modern international law experts cringe. This wasn't just about land. It was about securing Russia's western borders and neutralizing a potential threat. After all, a weakened Poland was a Poland that wouldn't meddle in Russian affairs. But let's not sugarcoat it. The partitions of Poland were a diplomatic heist of epic proportions, and they left a legacy of resentment that would fester for generations. For the Polish people, it was a national tragedy, a loss of sovereignty that would haunt their collective memory. For Russia, it was a triumph of realpolitik, a demonstration of Catherine's ability to play the great powers off against each other while advancing her own interests. Catherine's foreign policy wasn't just about territorial expansion. It was about transforming Russia into a European power with a global reach. She established diplomatic relations with the United States, sending the first Russian envoy to the fledgling nation in 1780. It was a savvy move that positioned Russia as a friend to the American cause, albeit from a safe distance. After all, Catherine had little interest in getting embroiled in the messy business of American independence, preferring instead to watch from the sidelines, like a spectator, at a particularly entertaining play. As the 18th century drew to a close, Catherine continued to juggle the demands of empire, expansion, and diplomacy. Her foreign policy was a balancing act worthy of a tightrope walker, requiring constant adjustments to keep her empire on track. It was a testament to her political acumen and her understanding of the complex web of alliances and enmities that defined European politics. Yet, despite her successes, Catherine's reign was not without its critics. Some viewed her expansionist policies as a betrayal of Enlightenment ideals, arguing that her pursuit of empire was at odds with her professed commitment to liberty and equality. It's the kind of contradiction that would make any philosopher worth their salt scratch their head. How could the Star of the North, the champion of Enlightenment thought, also be the architect of aggressive territorial conquest? The answer, perhaps, lies in the complexities of human ambition. Catherine was a ruler who understood that ideals and reality often make uneasy bedfellows. Her reign was a balancing act, a constant negotiation between the world as it was and the world as she wished it to be. She was a monarch who embraced the contradictions of her time, using them to her advantage as she navigated the turbulent waters of 18th-century politics. As the curtain began to fall on Catherine's reign, her legacy was already taking shape. She had transformed Russia into a formidable empire, a power to be reckoned with on the world stage. Her foreign policy, marked by bold expansion and strategic alliances, had reshaped the map of Europe and positioned Russia as a key player in the global arena. Yet, for all her accomplishments, Catherine's story was far from over. Her final years would bring new challenges and triumphs, setting the stage for the next chapter in the saga of Russia's most enigmatic empress. But that's a tale for another time, as Catherine's complex legacy continued to unfold, one strategic move at a time. So, here we are, staring down the barrel of Catherine the Great's legacy, a kaleidoscope of ambition, enlightenment, and the occasional scandal that could make a tabloid editor blush. But before we pop the champagne on her accomplishments, let's take a moment to sift through the myths and legends that have swirled around her like a particularly persistent blizzard. First up, the elephant in the room, or should I say the horse. Yes, that infamous, salacious rumor about Catherine and a stallion. Spoiler alert, it's pure fiction, the result of malicious gossip, and a testament to humanity's love for a juicy, albeit absurd, story. In reality, Catherine's personal life was more soap opera than bestiality scandal. Her love affairs with a series of dashing gentlemen like Grigory Potemkin and Alexander Lanskoy were the talk of the court, but hardly the stuff of scandalous legend. These relationships, while colorful, were also strategic alliances that helped her maintain power. So, let's give the horse story a rest, and maybe focus on the real drama of her love life, which was more about political maneuvering than barnyard antics. Catherine's personal life aside, her reign was a balancing act between the ideals of the Enlightenment and the gritty realities of Russian governance. She was an empress who wore many hats, reformer, diplomat, and yes, sometimes a ruthless autocrat. Her efforts to modernize Russia were a mixed bag, a cocktail of progressive ideas and traditional constraints. On the one hand, she championed education and legal reform, as we've seen. On the other, she was not above wielding absolute power when it suited her interests. Take, for instance, her response to the Pugachev rebellion. The revolt was a wake-up call that sent shockwaves through her administration, leading her to tighten her grip on the empire with a series of repressive measures. It was a classic case of enlightened despotism. Lofty ideals in theory, iron fist in practice. Catherine's knack for navigating the choppy waters of politics was nothing short of impressive. She played the game like a seasoned poker player, bluffing and betting her way to victory. Her foreign policy was a testament to her strategic genius, as she expanded Russian territory and influence across Europe and beyond. Yet this expansion came at a cost, both financially and morally. The annexation of Crimea and the partitions of Poland, while brilliant in their execution, left a trail of resentment and unrest that would haunt Eastern Europe for generations. Catherine's Russia became a formidable empire, but it was an empire built on the backs of the serfs and the conquered, with all the ethical murkiness that entails. Speaking of serfs, Catherine's relationship with serfdom is one of those historical contradictions that leaves you scratching your head. Despite her Enlightenment ideals, she did little to alleviate the plight of the serfs, who remained shackled to a feudal system that was as outdated as powdered wigs. In fact, her reign saw a tightening of serfdom as she expanded its reach to newly acquired territories. Her dependency on the nobility, who were the real puppet masters of serfdom, made any meaningful reform virtually impossible. It's a bit like trying to reform a diet while surrounded by chocolate cake, tempting, but ultimately doomed to fail. Economically, Catherine's reign was a period of growth, but also of inequality. The Russian economy remained agrarian at its core, with serfdom as its backbone. While Catherine encouraged industrial development and expanded trade, these efforts were not enough to bridge the vast economic divide between the nobility and the peasantry. The glittering facade of the Russian court masked a society rife with poverty and discontent, a divide that would simmer beneath the surface, until it boiled over in the revolutions of the 20th century. Now, let's talk legacy. Catherine the Great is often hailed as one of history's most enlightened rulers, a title she earned through her correspondence with the greatest minds of her time and her ambitious reform agenda. But she was also a pragmatist, a ruler who understood that ideals must often be tempered with reality. Her reign was a masterclass in realpolitik, a lesson in how to wield power with both vision and ruthlessness. She left behind an empire that was stronger and more modern than the one she inherited, but also one that bore the scars of her ambitions. Her legacy is a tapestry of contradictions, woven with threads of progress and repression, enlightenment and autocracy. Catherine was a ruler who embraced the complexities of her time, a woman who understood that leadership is not a simple matter of right or wrong, but a delicate dance of compromise and conviction. Her story is a reminder that history is not just a series of dates and events, but a reflection of the human condition, with all its flaws and triumphs. So as we close the book on Catherine the Great, let's remember her not just as a larger-than-life figure, but as a ruler who dared to dream big, even as she grappled with the messy realities of power. Her life was a testament to the possibilities and limitations of leadership, a story that continues to resonate in our modern world. And while the myths and legends may persist, the truth of her reign is far more compelling, a tale of ambition, resilience, and the enduring struggle to shape the world in the image of our ideals. Henry Roman VIII wasn't always the rotund ruler of your high school history textbook fame. Once upon a time, before he became England's infamous serial husband, he was just a backup plan. Yes, you heard that right. The man who would redefine the marital landscape of Tudor England was originally intended as a spare. When Henry was born on June 28, 1491, he was the second son of King Henry Roman VII and Elizabeth of York. His older brother, Arthur, was the golden child, the heir apparent, the one who was supposed to wear the crown. But fate, with its wicked sense of humor, had other plans. Arthur was groomed from birth to be king. He was the apple of his father's eye, the one who got the better tutors, more attention, and even a shiny new bride named Catherine of Aragon. Meanwhile, young Henry was left to his own devices, which mostly involved sports, jousting, and other activities that would make your Fitbit proud. He was the kid brother with all the fun and none of the responsibility. But when Arthur died suddenly in 1502 at the tender age of 15, the spotlight swung to Henry, who was just a 10-year-old with a penchant for mischief and a formidable tennis serve. Fast forward to 1509, and the world has a new king. Henry Roman VIII ascended to the throne at 17, a teenager with a crown too heavy for his head, quite literally. It probably didn't help that his primary education had been more about physical prowess than political acumen. His early reign was like watching your little brother take the wheel of the family car. Exciting, terrifying, and with a good chance of a fender bender. Yet, Henry was determined to be a Renaissance king, a jack of all trades, a master of just enough to get by. In those early years, Henry was a bit of a show-off. He was tall, over 6 feet, an impressive height back in the day when most people were about as tall as your average modern teenager. He was athletic, spending as much time on horseback or swinging a racket as he did on the throne. His penchant for sports was legendary. He once lost 50 ducats in a game of tennis, a princely sum considering that the annual income of a laborer was about 5 ducats. Talk about putting your money where your mouth is. Despite his youthful enthusiasm, Henry didn't exactly come pre-packaged with kingly instincts. He was more of a party king than a policy king. His court was an extravagant affair, filled with music, dance, and enough feasting to make a modern-day wedding look like a potluck. He was a man of many talents, or at least many interests. He fancied himself a musician, a composer, and even had a hand in a bit of poetry. If Twitter had existed back then, you could bet he'd have been posting sonnets between jousting matches. Still, for all his cultural swagger, Henry's understanding of statecraft was, shall we say, a work in progress. Initially, he relied heavily on his advisors, like the wily Cardinal Wolsey, who knew how to navigate the choppy waters of diplomacy, while Henry focused on his extracurriculars. Wolsey was the brains behind many of Henry's early decisions, kind of like a tutor doing all the homework for his student while the student enjoys recess. Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, was both a personal and political maneuver. The union was intended to solidify ties with Spain, and it came with its own set of controversies and papal dispensations. Because, marrying your brother's widow was a bit of a dicey affair even in the 16th century. But Catherine was no shrinking violet. She was smart, popular, and initially their marriage was a happy one. They bonded over shared interests like hunting and had a mutual respect that was the envy of European courts. But spoiler alert, things would eventually go south faster than you can say. Annulment. In these early days, Henry's reign was marked by an eagerness to prove himself, a youthful exuberance that sometimes bordered on recklessness. He was the king who wanted to have it all, the glory of a warrior, the sophistication of a scholar, and the splendor of a king. Yet his reign would soon be tested in ways that no amount of jousting practice could prepare him for. But that, as they say, is a story for another time. Right now, young Henry is still dreaming big before life and marriage gets a bit more complicated. So here we are with an ambitious young King Henry Roman VIII, riding high on dreams of glory, grandeur, and wait for it, domestic bliss. But as they say in Hollywood, the sequel is where things get real. The honeymoon phase with Catherine of Aragon was all roses and sunshine, but soon enough, England's most famous marital drama since Lancelot and Guinevere kicked into high gear. And folks, saga makes a soap opera look like a Sunday picnic. Let's rewind to understand the stakes here. Catherine wasn't just any queen. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the power couple who funded Christopher Columbus's little jaunt across the Atlantic. Marrying her was like acquiring a deluxe insurance policy for an alliance with Spain. But there was one major hitch in the happily ever after. Catherine couldn't produce a male heir. She gave Henry a daughter, Mary, in 1516, but in the male-dominated world of Tudor politics, a girl just didn't cut it. Henry needed a son, a robust little future king, to secure his dynasty. No son, no continuation of the Tudor line. It was like having Netflix without a subscription, utterly pointless for Henry's grand plans. Fast forward to 1527, and Henry's patience was wearing thinner than his hairline would in later years. Enter Anne Boleyn, the vivacious, witty lady-in-waiting who caught the king's eye and, more importantly, his heart. Anne wasn't just a pretty face. She was a woman of ambition and cunning, fully aware of the power dynamics at play. She played hard to get, refusing to be just another notch on Henry's royal belt. Instead, she aimed straight for the crown. Talk about a career move. Now, the problem was that Henry was still very much married to Catherine. Divorce wasn't exactly a thing back then, not unless you fancied a confrontation with the Pope. And the Pope had no intention of nullifying Henry's marriage just because he found a younger model. The papal refusal was partly because of political pressures from Catherine's nephew, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. It was like asking your girlfriend's burly older brother for permission to break up with her, awkward and unlikely to end well. But Henry wasn't about to let some distant pope dictate his love life. His solution: if Rome wouldn't give him an annulment, he'd simply create a new church with himself at the helm. Thus began the English Reformation, a national makeover driven by one man's marital woes. In 1534, the Act of Supremacy declared Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. He'd effectively turned his personal dilemma into a religious revolution. Who needs divine intervention when you've got self-appointed divine authority? In the process, Henry dissolved monasteries, seized church lands, and basically rewrote England's spiritual playbook. It was a land grab that would make modern real estate moguls green with envy. The Church of England was born out of necessity, ambition, and a healthy dose of petulance. Henry had managed to untangle his love life from Rome's grasp, although at the cost of excommunication. But hey, if you're going to be excommunicated, you might as well do it with style. The irony. Despite the grand gestures and the upheaval, Henry's quest for a son from Anne Boleyn would also end in disappointment. Eventually, Anne gave birth to Elizabeth in 1533, a girl who would later outshine her father in every conceivable way. But in those early years, Elizabeth was just another reminder of the male heir that eluded him. Life, as it turns out, is full of twists, not all of them welcome. Now, let's take a step back and marvel at the absurdity. Here's a king who reshaped a nation's religious landscape because he couldn't convince the Pope to let him swap wives. It's like burning down your house to avoid a mortgage payment. Drastic, costly, and incredibly effective in the short term. The English Reformation wasn't just about theology. It was about power and control, with Henry at the epicenter of his own tempest. What's fascinating is how personal whims can ripple outwards, affecting millions and altering the course of history. Henry's maneuvering led to centuries of religious and political change, yet it all started with one man's quest for a son. It's a potent reminder that history's grand narratives are often shaped by individual desires, as capricious as they are compelling. In the end, Henry got his divorce, but at a price that included political chaos and religious strife. Anne Boleyn became queen, but her reign was tragically short-lived, another episode in our unfolding drama. But that's a tale for another time. For now, let's leave Henry basking in the glow of his newfound ecclesiastical power, oblivious to the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. So, here we are, with Henry basking in his ecclesiastical triumph, unaware that the real storm was about to hit, not the kind forecasted by weathermen, but the kind that makes a tabloid editor's day. Enter Anne Boleyn, the woman who had played her cards so well in resisting Henry's advances, only to find that the throne was more of a heart seat than a comfy armchair. Anne's rise was as meteoric as it was precarious. She was now Queen of England, but in a kingdom where crowns were about as stable as a house of cards in a wind tunnel. Anne wasn't just a footnote in the history books. She was the whole chapter. Her coronation in 1533 was a lavish affair, costing around £1,000, equivalent to several £100,000 today. But the grandeur of the event was a stark contrast to the whispers already circulating around the court. Anne was pregnant at the time, and Henry was banking on a male heir like a gambler on a heart streak. Spoiler alert, the dice didn't roll his way. Anne gave birth to Elizabeth, a girl who would eventually become one of England's greatest monarchs. But let's be honest, that was little consolation to Henry at the time. Anne's inability to produce a male heir was not just a personal disappointment for Henry, it was a political liability. The Tudor dynasty's future hung on the thread of male succession, a thread that Anne couldn't seem to weave. The court was rife with intrigue, and Anne's enemies were sharpening their knives with glee. It didn't help that Anne was known for her sharp tongue and political savvy. While these traits might get you a promotion in a modern boardroom, they were less appreciated in the Tudor court, where the ideal queen was seen and not heard. By 1536, Anne's situation had gone from precarious to downright perilous. She had suffered several miscarriages, and Henry's wandering eye had landed on Jane Seymour, one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting. Jane was the anti-Anne, demure, docile, and everything Henry suddenly realized he wanted. It was like Henry traded in his sports car for a minivan, less flashy, more practical. Anne's fall was swift and brutal. Accused of adultery, incest, and treason, she was tried and executed in May of that year. Her death was a grim reminder that the Tudor court was no place for the faint-hearted or the outspoken. Jane Seymour's reign was short but significant. Married Henry just days after Anne's execution, a move that makes rebound relationships look tame by comparison. Jane was the only one of Henry's wives to give him the male heir he so desperately desired. In 1537, she gave birth to Edward, a healthy baby boy, finally putting an end to Henry's anxiety over succession. Unfortunately, the joy was short-lived. Jane died just days after childbirth, perhaps due to puerperal fever, a common and often fatal complication in an era where hand sanitizer wasn't a thing. Jane's death left a void in Henry's life, but also a peculiar sense of satisfaction. She was the wife who fulfilled her royal duty, and Henry would remember her as his true wife, a sentiment that must have been news to the others. Jane was buried with all the honors befitting a queen, and Henry would eventually be laid to rest beside her, a testament to the fact that in the end, she was the one who got it right, or so the narrative went. But Henry's love life was far from over. Enter Anne of Cleves, the fourth wife who famously lasted about as long as a New Year's resolution. Their marriage was a political arrangement, brokered to secure an alliance with Anne's brother, the Duke of Cleves. Henry, who had never met Anne, relied on a portrait by Hans Holbein the younger to judge her charms. Alas, Holbein's brush might have been dipped in flattery, for when Anne arrived in England, Henry was less than enchanted. He famously declared her appearance akin to that of a Flanders mare, proving once again that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, or perhaps, in this case, in the brush of the painter. Their marriage, which took place in January 1540, was a disaster from day one. Henry's disappointment was so profound that it became legendary. It was as if he had ordered a premium steak only to receive a soggy salad. The union was annulled just 6 months later, on the grounds of non-consummation and Anne's pre-contract to another nobleman. In a twist of fate, Anne ended up with the best deal of all Henry's wives. She received a generous settlement, a lavish house, and the title of King's Sister, allowing her to live comfortably and free of the marital roller coaster that had claimed her predecessors. Anne of Cleves' exit from Henry's life was more amicable than anyone could have anticipated, especially considering the Tudor tendency for more permanent solutions to marital problems. She remained on good terms with both Henry and his children, a testament to her own diplomatic skills, and perhaps a lesson in the art of exiting gracefully. As we take stock of Henry's marital escapades, it's clear that each wife brought her own drama and intrigue to the Tudor court. Anne Boleyn's ambition, Jane Seymour's serendipity, and Anne of Cleves' fortuitous escape all contributed to the rich tapestry of Henry's reign. But these stories are far from over. Henry's heart, and indeed his throne, would see more upheaval in the years to come. The merry-go-round of matrimony was still spinning, and the next chapter in this saga promises even more fascinating twists. So, stay tuned, because the Tudors are far from done with their historical hijinks. And just like that, Henry's matrimonial merry-go-round was about to take another spin. But let's hit pause on his romantic escapades for a moment and zoom in on another one of Henry's great loves, spending money like it was going out of fashion. Because, folks, if Henry Roman VIII had a superpower, it was making money disappear faster than a magician at a kid's party. As the 1540s rolled in, Henry was in his 40s, and let's just say he wasn't aging gracefully. The once athletic king was now more couch potato than courtly knight, a transformation accelerated by a jousting accident in 1536. Imagine this: Henry, clad in armor, gallivanting about like a medieval action hero, only to be unceremoniously unhorsed and knocked unconscious. It was a moment that turned his life into a medieval soap opera, with a side of medical drama. The accident left him with a severely injured leg, which never healed properly and became ulcerated, a grim reminder that even kings aren't immune to life's unpleasant surprises. The jousting calamity marked the beginning of Henry's physical decline. His waistline expanded as his health deteriorated, and his fiery temper became as legendary as his waistband. But despite his physical limitations, Henry's ambitions were as boundless as ever. He fancied himself a warrior king, and what better way to prove it than by embarking on military campaigns that would make even the most reckless gambler think twice. Enter the Italian Wars, a series of conflicts that were, frankly, a bit of a mess. Think of it as Europe's most dysfunctional family reunion, with everyone vying for a slice of Italy's proverbial pizza. Henry, never one to miss out on a good squabble, poured vast sums into these campaigns, determined to make England a major player on the European stage. The problem: war is expensive, like really expensive. In 1544, Henry launched an invasion of France, capturing Boulogne at a cost that could make even the most hardened banker weep. The venture drained the royal coffers faster than you can say bad investment. To fund his military ambitions, Henry turned to a strategy that could be described as creative accounting at best and financial disaster at worst. He debased the currency, a fancy way of saying he reduced the silver content in coins while maintaining their face value. It was like watering down your beer but still charging full price, not exactly a crowd pleaser. This move led to inflation, and by the time the 1540s were in full swing, England's economy was as stable as a three-legged stool. But wait, there's more. Henry's penchant for grandeur extended to his personal projects, including the construction of lavish palaces and the refurbishment of existing ones. His architectural endeavors were as extravagant as his courtly feasts, and both were funded by the dissolution of the monasteries. Remember that land grab? Yep, Henry was cashing in on that ecclesiastical real estate bonanza, selling off former church properties to the highest bidder. It was a win-win for Henry's treasury and a lose-lose for England's monastic communities. Meanwhile, back in the realm of domestic unrest, the Pilgrimage of Grace erupted in 1536, fueled by discontent over Henry's religious reforms and economic policies. Picture this: tens of thousands of Northern Catholics marching in protest, brandishing banners, and demanding the restoration of the monasteries. The pilgrimage was the largest uprising of Henry's reign, and a clear sign that not everyone was on board with his ecclesiastical shake-up. Henry, ever the master of political maneuvering, promised pardons and reforms to quell the rebellion, only to later execute the leaders when the dust settled. It was a classic case of bait and switch, Tudor style. The Pilgrimage of Grace wasn't just about religion, though. It was also a reflection of the economic hardships faced by ordinary people. The dissolution of the monasteries had left many without support, as these institutions had been the social safety nets of the time. With the monasteries gone and inflation on the rise, the economic landscape was as bleak as a rainy day in London. As we sift through the wreckage of Henry's financial policies, it's clear that his reign was a roller coaster of ambition and extravagance. He was a king who dreamed big and spent bigger, often with little regard for the long-term consequences. His military campaigns drained the treasury, his religious reforms sparked uprisings, and his health was in free fall. Yet, for all his flaws, Henry remained a larger-than-life figure, a king whose personal whims shaped the course of a nation. If there's a lesson to be learned here, it's that power and prudence don't always go hand in hand. Henry's reign was a testament to the dangers of unchecked ambition and the perils of playing fast and loose with the nation's finances. It's a story as old as time, one that continues to resonate in boardrooms and political chambers to this day. So, as we leave Henry nursing his leg and his ego, with England's economy teetering on the brink, it's clear that the Tudor saga is far from over. The king's health may be faltering, but his appetite for drama is not. And with more wives waiting in the wings, we can be sure that the story of Henry Roman VIII has a few more twists and turns in store. Stay tuned, because in the world of the Tudors, the only certainty is uncertainty. And just like that, we're back in the chaotic, unpredictable world of Henry Roman VIII, where the only thing more unstable than his marriages was his health. By the time we hit the 1540, Henry was less the dashing young prince of his youth and more the grumpy old king with a penchant for drama and a leg wound that never let him forget his jousting days. But don't worry, the saga of his matrimonial misadventures wasn't over yet. Enter Catherine Howard, wife number 5, and a stark reminder that the Tudor court was as treacherous as a game of chess played on a ship in a storm. Catherine was a teenager, full of life and perhaps a bit too much enthusiasm for the role of queen. She was also a cousin of Anne Boleyn, which should have been Henry's first red flag. But old habits die hard, and Henry, now pushing 50 and with the waistline to prove it, was smitten. Catherine's youthful charm seemed to breathe new life into the aging king, although new life might be pushing it, given his deteriorating health. The marriage, solemnized in 1540, was doomed from the start. Catherine's alleged indiscretions, let's call them youthful indiscretions, caught up with her faster than you can say Tudor gossip. Her past relationships and rumored infidelities were like fresh meat to the wolves of the court, and it wasn't long before her head was on the chopping block, literally. In 1542, she was executed for treason, a chilling reminder that in Henry's world, the line between favor and fatality was razor-thin. With Catherine Howard's demise, Henry's matrimonial dance card was getting worryingly full, but that didn't stop him from one last tango. Catherine Parr, the 6th and final wife, was more nurse than lover, a pragmatic choice for a king whose health was as fragile as an Elizabethan ruff. Catherine Parr was intelligent, well-read, and a calming influence, a bit like the soothing cup of tea after a particularly turbulent day. She outlived Henry, which in itself was a feat worthy of a Tudor medal. Henry's personal life, however, was not the only thing in decline. By the time he reached his final years, his health was a catalogue of ailments, obesity, gout, and those infamous leg ulcers that would make even a hypochondriac shudder. His once vibrant court was now a place of whispered intrigues and shifting alliances, a reflection of the king's waning power. In January 1547, Henry Roman VIII shuffled off this mortal coil, leaving behind a kingdom as fractured as his love life. Now, let's talk about Henry's legacy, because oh boy, it's a mixed bag. On one hand, Henry was the king who broke away from Rome, established the Church of England, and set the stage for religious reform. He was a patron of the arts and had a hand in shaping the English Renaissance. His reign saw the strengthening of the Royal Navy, which would go on to become the foundation of England's maritime dominance. But on the flip side, his reign was marred by financial mismanagement, religious persecution, and enough executions to fill a medieval morgue. And then there was the succession drama, the cherry on top of Henry's tumultuous reign. His desperate quest for a male heir led to a string of marriages, political upheaval, and religious transformations. Yet, the irony, his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, would go on to become two of England's most famous and influential monarchs. Mary I, known as Bloody Mary for her persecution of Protestants, reigned from 1553 to 1558, while Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen, ruled from 1558 to 1603, overseeing a golden age of exploration, culture, and power. Henry's only legitimate son, Edward VI, did ascend to the throne, but his reign was short-lived, lasting just 6 years from 1547 to 1553 before his untimely death at the age of 15. Edward's death threw England into a succession crisis, leading to the brief and ill-fated rule of Lady Jane Grey, known as the 9 Days Queen. It was a turbulent time, a game of thrones that made actual thrones look like child's play. So, what do we make of Henry Roman VIII, this larger-than-life king who spent as much time shaping England's future as he did orchestrating his own scandals? Historians and armchair enthusiasts alike are still captivated by his story, warts, quite literally, and all. Henry was a man of contradictions, a king who sought glory on the battlefield and in the bedchamber, often with disastrous consequences. His reign was a testament to the power of personal ambition and the peril of unchecked authority. In the end, Henry Roman VIII is remembered not just for his 6 wives, but for the seismic changes he set in motion. His legacy is one of transformation and turbulence, a time of great upheaval that paved the way for modern England. And while he may not have secured his dynasty through a male heir, his daughters ensured the Tudor name would be etched into history, proof that sometimes the best plans are the ones you never make. As we close the book on Henry Roman VIII, remember that history is not just a series of dates and facts, but a tapestry woven from the threads of human experience. It's messy, complicated, and endlessly fascinating, just like the man himself. So here's to Henry, the king who gave us more than we bargained for, and a story that keeps us coming back for more. And who knows, maybe somewhere, Henry's looking down with a wry smile, amused by how his life, full of folly and grandeur, became the stuff of legends. In the grand theatre of European history, Louis Roman XIV was the ultimate drama king, literally and figuratively. Before he dazzled the world as the Sun King, a title he gave to himself because why not? Eladat, c'est moi, sounds better with a celestial nickname. He was just a kid navigating the kind of political chaos that could make Game of Thrones look like a family picnic. Born on September 5, 1638, Louis Dieudonné, which fittingly means gift of God, was thrust into the spotlight early. But let's not pretend his path to power was all sunshine and courtiers. Louis' early years were marred by the Fronde, a series of civil wars in France from 1648 to 1653 that were about as fun as a medieval dentist appointment. It was a rebellion against royal authority, and it was all about power, taxes, and the nobility getting a bit too big for their britches. Picture this, a young boy king, barely out of diapers, with a front row seat to noble squabbles, barricades in the streets of Paris, and enough intrigue to fuel a dozen spy novels. His mother, Anne of Austria, and the cunning Cardinal Mazarin were his regents, trying to juggle power while dodging political daggers. Talk about a tough crowd. The Fronde was a chaotic mess, full of backstabbing nobles and opportunistic power grabs. It was like trying to herd cats, if the cats were armed with swords and a penchant for rebellion. And for young Louis, it was a formative experience that taught him a crucial lesson. Trust no one, especially if they have a title and a questionable mustache. This lifetime lesson in paranoia would eventually fuel his obsession with absolute power. In Louis' mind, if you wanted something done right, you had to do it yourself, or at least control every aspect of it with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. Fast forward a few years, and we find Louis at his coronation in Reims in 1654. This wasn't just any crowning. It was the kind of event that makes modern royal weddings look like modest backyard gatherings. The French monarchy didn't skimp on the pageantry. The crown Louis wore, the crown of Charlemagne, was practically a medieval bling statement. And the costs, astronomical of course. Running a kingdom wasn't cheap, and neither was the ceremony. But when you're the king, what's a little extravagance among friends? Never mind that France was practically digging through the couch cushions for spare change. At just 15, Louis was crowned king, but let's be honest, at that age, most of us were still figuring out how to tie a tie properly for school dances. Yet here was Louis, swathed in velvet and embroidered with enough fleur-de-lis to make a garden weep, embarking on a mission to consolidate power in a realm that was 1 part glorious and 3 parts unruly. It's no wonder he developed a knack for micromanagement. When you've seen your country nearly torn apart by nobles who think they can do your job better, you'd probably want to hold the reins pretty tightly too. Despite the grandeur and the gilded halls, Louis' teenage years were as awkward as any. He was a young man trying to grow into his own skin, albeit one draped in silks and brocades. He was known to have been a bit on the reserved side, and not just because the weight of the crown might have been literally pulling him down. Imagine trying to learn the ropes of kingship while your elders bicker and the world watches your every move. No pressure, right? His youth was peppered with efforts to assert control and stabilize the monarchy. It was like trying to steady a ship in a storm while simultaneously figuring out how to captain it. The Fronde had shown him the fragility of power, and he wasn't about to let his grip slip. By the time Louis was ready to truly take the reins, he had developed a keen sense of how to wield authority, ensuring that the court revolved around him as surely as the planets orbit the sun. Hence, the Sun King was born, ready to shine, or at least spend like there was no tomorrow. As Louis matured, he began to craft an image of himself as the embodiment of the state. And why not? When you grow up under siege, both literally and metaphorically, you learn to project strength and control. His reign would become a study in contrasts, glorious art and culture juxtaposed with relentless control and centralization. But those are tales for another time. For now, bask in the early years of a king who learned early on that in the Game of Thrones, it's not enough to just play. You must dominate the field. And thus, Louis embarked on his grand project that would become a symbol of absolute monarchy, a place so opulent it could make even the most lavish Instagram influencer feel like they were slumming it. Welcome to Versailles, the palace that started as a modest hunting lodge, but ended up as the crown jewel of Louis's reign, glistening with enough gold leaf to blind a small village. Now, if you've ever tried to renovate your kitchen and found yourself overwhelmed by choices and costs, imagine multiplying that by, 1,000,000. Louis wasn't just redecorating, he was crafting a monument to his rule. The transformation of Versailles from a quaint retreat into the epitome of royal excess was not a weekend DIY project. It was a full-blown spectacle featuring 20,000 workers over several decades, beginning in the 1660. If that sounds like a lot of hands on deck, remember, this was before the days of power tools. The sheer manpower involved was a marvel in itself, a testament to Louis's commitment to making Versailles the center of the universe. Let's talk numbers, because nothing says power move like a hefty price tag. The cost of creating this gilded paradise was upwards of 116 million livres, the kind of spending that would make even the most extravagant of spendthrifts wince. Louis's treasury was practically hemorrhaging money, and the French economy felt every penny of it. Bread could be scarce, but there was never a shortage of marble and chandeliers at Versailles, because priorities right. The king's vision required endless resources, and he wasn't about to let little things like national debt or economic disparity get in the way of his dreams. But what exactly did all this money buy? A palace that would become the envy of Europe, for one. With its hall of mirrors, sprawling gardens, and fountains that seemed to defy gravity, Versailles was designed to dazzle and intimidate. The Hall of Mirrors alone, with its 357 mirrors strategically placed to catch the sunlight and reflect the splendor of the Sun King, was the ultimate power flex. It wasn't just architecture. It was propaganda in stone and glass, a daily reminder of Louis's dominion. And yet, for all its splendor, Versailles was less a paradise and more a gilded cage for the nobility. You see, Louis was a master at keeping his friends close and his potential enemies closer. By luring the nobles to Versailles with promises of courtly glamour, he effectively kept them under his watchful eye. It was like the world's most opulent daycare for aristocrats, complete with a set of etiquette rules so intricate they required a manual. Forget about actually ruling. These nobles were too busy worrying about the proper way to bow and which side of the heirloom rug to walk on. Here's a juicy tidbit. One of the most coveted positions at court was to hold Louis's chamber part. Yes, you heard that right. In a world where prestige was everything, even the most menial tasks could be a stepping stone to royal favor. The king's daily routine became an elaborate performance, and everyone wanted a role, however small. It was a bizarre ballet of flattery and protocol, all orchestrated to keep the nobles too preoccupied to plot rebellion. But beneath the polished veneer of Versailles lay some rather unseemly truths. For starters, the palace was notorious for its lack of plumbing. Imagine thousands of courtiers roaming the halls with nowhere to, relieve themselves. The reality was that chamber parts and makeshift facilities were the order of the day, and the gardens were often used for purposes far less picturesque than a leisurely stroll. It was as if the grandeur of Versailles was inversely proportional to its sanitation standards. The palace may have sparkled in the sunlight, but there were parts of it best left unseen and quite frankly unsmelled. So, was Versailles a paradise? If your idea of paradise includes endless parties, constant surveillance, and the ever-present risk of stepping in something unsavory, then sure, why not? For the rest of us, it might sound more like a golden cage, albeit one with a very impressive wine cellar. The myth of Versailles as a utopia of elegance and refinement is compelling, but the reality was much more complex, and at times, downright messy. In the end, Versailles was a testament to Louis's vision and vanity, an enduring symbol of his reign and the epitome of absolute monarchy. It was a place where the line between the legend and the truth blurred as easily as wine at a royal banquet. And while the Sun King shone brightly within its walls, the shadows of excess, intrigue, and ambition loomed large. As we leave this chapter of Louis's story and look forward to more tales of his reign, remember, in the Game of Thrones, appearances can be deceiving, and Versailles was the ultimate stage for this royal drama. Stay tuned, because the story of Louis Roman XIV is far from over. Versailles was a swirling cauldron of intrigue and ambition, where the real power players were those who knew how to navigate the gilded halls with a mix of flattery and cunning. Enter Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the Sun King's financial wizard, and the man who could squeeze money from a stone, or at least from France's overtaxed peasants. Colbert was Louis's go-to-guy for turning financial chaos into something resembling order. Picture a man who could balance a budget the way a juggler handles flaming torches. Colbert was that guy, and the kingdom was his circus. Colbert's masterstroke was mercantilism, an economic policy that involved boosting exports and minimizing imports. His goal was to make France the economic powerhouse of Europe, and he had the numbers to prove it. Under his watchful eye, the French Navy grew from a modest fleet to 276 ships by 1677, and French industries, from textiles to glassmaking, flourished. All of this was part of Louis's grand plan to not just rule France, but to make it the envy of every other nation. And while Colbert was counting coins, Louis was busy counting courtly sycophants. The court of Louis Roman XIV was a stage, and everyone wanted a starring role, especially the artists. Among the glitterati was Jean-Baptiste Parquelin, better known by his stage name Molière. He was the playwright who could craft a comedy out of the absurdity that was Versailles. His plays, like Tardif and The Misanthrope, were biting satires that poked fun at the pretentiousness of court life and the hypocrisy of the nobility. Molière had a knack for holding a mirror up to society and making everyone laugh, even if it was a nervous chuckle. But let's not pretend the Sun King was merely a patron of the arts out of pure benevolence. Louis was a master of image, and he understood the power of art as propaganda. The staggering amounts spent on art and culture were investments in his legacy. Think of it as the 17th century version of a social media campaign, except instead of Instagram likes, Louis was after glory and eternal prestige. He didn't just want to be remembered, He wanted to be immortalized. While artists like Molière were crafting narratives, Colbert was footing the bill. The state of the treasury was often precarious, and the economic disparity was as wide as the Hall of Mirrors was long. Yet, for all the financial juggling, Colbert couldn't escape the harsh realities of the time. France was a country where the grandeur of Versailles was mirrored by the grimness of the peasantry's plight. Bread riots weren't just a myth. They were a reality, a stark reminder that while the Sun King basked in luxury, many of his subjects struggled to survive. And then there were the courtiers, the self-proclaimed experts in the delicate art of staying in the king's good graces. Survival at court required more than just noble birth. It required a PhD in sycophancy. The race for royal favor was a relentless marathon, and the finish line was always moving. One misstep, one wrong word, and a courtier could find themselves demoted from the king's inner circle to the outer wastes of obscurity. It was a world where appearances were everything, and reality was as fluid as the wine at the king's banquets. The absurdity of court life was its own theatre, complete with roles like the royal wig-maker, because heaven forbid Louis's hair should ever look anything less than majestic. The king's wigs were a symbol of his status, towering creations that were as impractical as they were opulent. And if you think modern celebrity culture is excessive, consider the fact that the courtiers had to follow an elaborate set of etiquette rules that dictated everything from the correct angle of a bow to the precise distance one should stand from the king. It was less about respect and more about maintaining the illusion of order in a world teetering on the brink of chaos. Yet, for all its extravagance, Versailles was also a crucible of innovation. It was here that France's greatest minds gathered, whether they were artists, architects, or scientists. Louis's court was a magnet for talent, a place where ambition could either flourish or flounder. The king himself was a paradox, a man who could be both a ruthless autocrat and a generous patron. He was as complex as the system he presided over, a ruler who understood that power was as much about perception as it was about control. In the end, the people who made the Sun King's court tick were as varied as the threads in a tapestry. From the scheming ministers to the fawning courtiers, each played their part in the grand performance that was Louis's reign. It was a world of smoke and mirrors, where the line between reality and illusion was as thin as the silk that draped the king's throne. As we leave this chapter of Louis's story, remember that the Sun King's court was more than just a collection of opulent rooms and lavish parties. It was a microcosm of a society in flux, a reflection of a ruler who dared to build a world in his image, one extravagant brushstroke at a time. And while the legend of Louis Roman XIV continues to shine brightly, the shadows cast by his reign remain a testament to the price of power. Stay tuned, because the tale of the Sun King is far from finished, and there are more layers to peel back in this historical onion. In the sprawling tapestry of Louis Roman XIV reign, military ambition was the thread that bound much of his story, and boy, was it a tangled mess. The Sun King was as much about conquest as he was about courtly splendor, yet his military campaigns often resembled a soap opera more than a strategic masterclass. Take the War of Spanish Succession, for instance. It was less of a battle cry, and more like a prolonged, expensive game of chess where everyone forgot the rules halfway through. Now, let's not pretend Louis's military endeavors were all about glory and gallant charges. Behind the grandiose paintings of victorious battles hung in Versailles, there was a reality filled with logistical nightmares and miscalculations that would make a modern strategist cringe. Louis's dream of expanding France's borders was as ambitious as it was costly. At its height, the French army was a force to be reckoned with, boasting around 400,000 troops, a number that could shade even a modern superpower. But let's talk economics for a second. Picture Louis's treasury as a leaky bucket. No matter how much gold he poured in, it just kept slipping away through the cracks. Wars, you see, are not cheap affairs. The War of the Spanish Succession alone drained France of resources to the tune of over 1.5 billion livres. That's billion with a B, folks. It was like trying to fill a pool with a teaspoon. The French economy groaned under the weight of Louis's ambitions, and the peasants, well, they weren't exactly thrilled to be footing the bill for the Sun King's military exploits. The War of Spanish Succession was sparked by the death of the childless Charles Roman II of Spain in 1700. This wasn't just any royal vacancy. It was the European equivalent of a Black Friday sale, with every major power scrambling to grab a piece of the Spanish pie. Louis, ever the opportunist, saw a chance to place his grandson, Philip of Anjou, on the Spanish throne. But surprise, this didn't sit well with the rest of Europe, who were justifiably concerned about France and Spain becoming the 18th century version of a supergroup. What followed was a series of alliances and counter-alliances that would put any soap opera to shame. England, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire weren't exactly thrilled about Louis's family reunion plans, so they banded together in what they charmingly called the Grand Alliance. The ensuing war stretched from 1701 to 1714, a slog that saw battlefields from Spain to Italy lit up with the chaos of muskets and cannon fire. But Louis's military strategies were often more optimistic than realistic. His generals were sometimes chosen based on their courtly charm rather than their tactical acumen, a classic case of style over substance. This led to some spectacular blunders, like at the Battle of Blenheim in 1704, where the Duke of Marlborough handed the French a defeat so resounding it could be heard across the Channel. The myth of Louis as a military genius. Let's just say it took a few hits, and then there was the infamous attempt to replenish the treasury by debasing the currency. Think of it as a medieval version of printing money, only with more gold involved. It was a desperate move that led to inflation, making bread as expensive as the finest Bordeaux. Not exactly a recipe for domestic bliss, especially when your subjects are already disgruntled by the endless wars and sky-high taxes. Speaking of taxes, they were as varied as they were numerous. There was the taille, a direct land tax that weighed heavily on the peasants, and the gay belle, a salt tax that was about as popular as a wet blanket. Louis's tax collectors were about as welcome as a plague of locusts, scouring the countryside for every last sou. The economic disparity was stark, with the opulence of Versailles glaringly juxtaposed against the poverty of the countryside. Yet, despite the economic quagmire, the political maneuvering and war efforts continued. Louis's foreign policy was a complex web of alliances and rivalries, all aimed at asserting French dominance. He wasn't just playing the Game of Thrones, he was trying to rewrite the rulebook. But such ambition came with a cost, one that would eventually catch up with him. During the War of Spanish Succession, France saw both victories and defeats, but the toll on the kingdom was undeniable. Towns were ravaged, fields lay fallow, and the populace grew weary. The once gilded image of the Sun King began to tarnish under the weight of endless conflict. The European powers, meanwhile, were locked in a costly arms race, each trying to outdo the other in a relentless bid for supremacy. By the time the Treaty of Utrecht rolled around in 1713, effectively ending the war, France was exhausted. The agreement saw Philip V recognized as King of Spain, but he had to renounce any claim to the French throne, a bittersweet victory for Louis. The treaty reshaped Europe, but left France with a legacy of debt and a populace stretched to its limits. For all the romanticized visions of the Sun King leading his nation to glory, the reality was far more complicated. Louis's reign was a testament to both the heights of absolute power and the depths of human folly. His legacy was one of contrasts, a kingdom that shone brightly but cast long shadows. As we continue to unravel the tapestry of Louis Roman XIV reign, remember that the myth of the Sun King is as much about perception as it is about reality. In the end, his story is a reminder that even the grandest of ambitions can be humbled by the weight of their own excess. Stay tuned as we delve deeper, because the tale of Louis Roman XIV is far from over, and the lessons of his reign continue to resonate through history's corridors. As the curtains drew to a close on Louis Roman XIV's dramatic reign, the Sun King left behind a legacy as multifaceted as a Versailles chandelier. The splendor of his rule was undeniable, a dazzling display of power and prestige that transformed France into the cultural heartbeat of Europe. Yet, beneath the gilded veneer lay a tapestry woven with the threads of economic strain and social upheaval. It's the classic tale of living large and leaving the cleanup for someone else, except in this case, the someone else was an entire nation. Louis Roman XIV reign, from 1643 to 1715, was nothing short of epic. He was the king who transformed a country and built a palace that could make even the guards green with envy. But let's not kid ourselves. The costs of maintaining such opulence were as astronomical as the sun around which Louis fancied himself orbiting. The national debt by the end of his reign was a staggering 3 billion livres, a figure that could make even a modern economist's eyes water. Louis's penchant for war, art, and architecture drained the coffers faster than you could say, "Eladat, c'est moi." The aftermath of Louis's policies played out like a slow-motion car crash, with the peasants bearing the brunt of the impact. Imagine slogging through fields from dawn till dusk, only to find that your taxes were funding another wing of Versailles, or yet another ill-fated military campaign. Bread riots and tax revolts were the not-so-gentle murmurs of a population pushed to its limits. The gay bell and tail taxes weighed heavily on the common folk, who found themselves footing the bill for a lifestyle they could barely fathom, let alone partake in. It was the age-old tale of the haves and have-nots, with the scale tipped precariously in favor of the former. And then there's the myth of the Sun King, which persists like a stubborn stain on the fabric of history. It's as if Louis's legacy has been run through a sepia filter, glossing over the less glamorous truths. The image of the Sun King, resplendent in his robes and surrounded by legions of fawning courtiers, is as seductive as it is misleading. It's the romantic notion of absolute power, untarnished by the messy realities of governance and fiscal responsibility. But why does this myth endure? Perhaps it's the allure of the spectacle, the idea that one man could hold sway over an entire nation with nothing but charisma and a penchant for pageantry. As the years rolled on, the consequences of Louis's reign became increasingly apparent. The very foundation of the French monarchy, once as solid as the marble halls of Versailles, began to crumble. The seeds of discontent sown during his reign would eventually bloom into the French Revolution, a cataclysmic event that would reshape not just France, but the entire world. The monarchy's decline was not simply a result of poor economic management, but also a failure to adapt to the changing tides of political and social thought. Louis's embrace of absolute power left little room for flexibility, and his successors paid the price for his rigidity. Yet, for all the harsh truths, there's an undeniable allure to the story of Louis Roman XIV. Perhaps it's the sheer audacity of his vision, the way he dared to dream on a scale that few before or since have matched. Perhaps it's the spectacle of Versailles, a monument to human ambition that continues to captivate visitors centuries later. Or perhaps it's the enduring appeal of a good drama, complete with heroes, villains, and enough plot twists to keep even the most jaded of historians on their toes. In the end, the legacy of Louis Roman XIV is a reminder of both the heights and pitfalls of power. His reign was a glittering saga of triumph and excess, a masterclass in the art of spectacle that continues to enthrall and caution in equal measure. The Sun King may have set, but the shadows he cast still linger, offering lessons for those willing to look beyond the glitz and glamour. As we wrap up this tale of grandeur and folly, let's take a moment to reflect on the enduring fascination with royal spectacle. Perhaps it's because, despite the passage of time, the human penchant for pomp and circumstance remains undiminished. After all, who among us can resist the allure of a good story, especially one that glitters as brightly as the Hall of Mirrors? So here's to Louis Roman XIV, the Sun King who burned brightly and left an indelible mark on the canvas of history. Remember, even in a world of shadows, a little sparkle can go a long way. If there was an Olympic event for political maneuvering, Empress Dowager Cixi would have taken gold, and probably sold it back to the highest bidder for a tidy profit. She entered the Forbidden City in 1851 as just another face in the concubine crowd, a low-ranking consort to the Xianfeng Emperor. But the real story begins with her ascension from these humble origins to become the de facto ruler of China, and she managed to do this all while navigating the treacherous waters of 19th-century Chinese politics, a feat that makes modern office politics look like a game of Candyland. The Qing dynasty at the time was about as stable as a Jenga tower in an earthquake. Western powers were knocking at the door, not just knocking, more like kicking it down with the force of a rugby team, and inside, the empire was buckling under its own weight. The Taiping Rebellion, which kicked off in 1850, was already a nightmare of epic proportions, causing an estimated 20 to 30 million deaths over 14 years. Yep, you heard that right. Millions. That's not just a statistic. That's a jaw-dropping human catastrophe that makes Game of Thrones look like a melodrama with a happy ending. Into this mess walked Cixi, a woman who was as underestimated as she was ambitious. Born in 1835 to a Manchu family of moderate standing, her rise seemed improbable, if not impossible. But if Cixi had a superpower, it was her uncanny ability to read the room. And by room, I mean a sprawling empire with a penchant for backstabbing and intrigue. Back then, the Forbidden City wasn't just a pretty name. It was a labyrinthine complex of power plays and whispered conspiracies. As a concubine, Cixi's initial role was to produce an heir, preferably male, and keep her head down. But she wasn't just any concubine. She was the mother of the emperor's only surviving son, the future Tangzhai emperor. And in the cutthroat world of the imperial harem, that was like holding a winning lottery ticket. When Xianfeng died in 1861, leaving behind a 5-year-old heir, Cixi saw her chance. The official regency was supposed to be led by a council of 8 elder statesmen. But Cixi, alongside the Empress Dowager, orchestrated a coup that would make even the most seasoned TV drama writer jealous. Using a mix of shrewd alliances and outright cunning, she sidelined the regents, essentially saying, "Thanks for your service, gentlemen, but we'll take it from here." And just like that, Cixi was in the driver's seat, with Xin as her co-pilot. Now, let's talk about the Qing dynasty's precarious situation. The Western powers were circling like sharks that smelled blood in the water, specifically opium-soaked water. The Opium Wars had left China battered and humiliated, with unequal treaties that gave foreign powers unprecedented control and access to Chinese ports and markets. Imagine signing a contract that not only cleans out your wallet, but also empties your fridge and rents out your living room to strangers, with you footing the bill. The perpetual threat from these Western powers was a constant headache for Cixi, but she had a knack for turning every potential disaster into an opportunity. When Western technology and ideas began seeping into China, she didn't just resist, she adapted. Cixi wasn't exactly a forward-thinking reformer by today's standards, but she was pragmatic enough to realize that modernization had its perks. Under her watch, China began its first, albeit faltering, steps toward modernization, building its first railways and telegraph lines, and even establishing a foreign affairs office. Sure, it was like putting a fresh coat of paint on a crumbling house, but it was a start. Cixi's reign was a constant balancing act between tradition and innovation, conservatism and reform. She was nothing if not a realist. She knew that the Qing dynasty's survival depended on navigating the treacherous waters of both domestic unrest and foreign aggression. Her ability to keep her head above water while others were sinking was nothing short of remarkable. Her political acumen was matched only by her flair for the dramatic. Cixi was known for her extravagant tastes, a penchant for luxury that bordered on the legendary. While the empire teetered on the edge of bankruptcy, she renovated the summer palace with funds that were supposed to modernize the navy. Critics would later accuse her of choosing a swan-shaped pleasure boat over battleships. And you know what? They weren't entirely wrong. But in Cixi's world, appearances mattered just as much as realities, and she knew how to wield both to her advantage. In the end, Cixi's story is one of contradictions and complexities. She was a woman who wielded immense power in a man's world, a conservative who embraced certain modernizations, and an imperialist who had to deal with the very real threat of imperialism from abroad. She was both a product of her time and an anomaly within it, a figure as enigmatic as she was influential. So, as we set the stage for the rest of Cixi's life, remember that she was a master of the long game, a strategist who understood that power lay not just in brute force, but in the subtleties of influence and control. She navigated a world where the stakes were always life and death, surviving and thriving in a time when the odds were stacked against her. Stay tuned, because the story of how she continued to shape the destiny of China is just getting started. Just when you thought Cixi's tale had exhausted its supply of political intrigue, she was about to pull a rabbit out of her imperial hat with her bold modernization plans. Picture this. The Qing dynasty, a creaky old ship barely floating in the stormy sea of the 19th century, desperately in need of an upgrade. And Cixi, with her cunning eye for opportunity, was ready to slap on some new sails and maybe even a shiny new engine. Enter the Imperial Navy and the telegraph lines, the technological wonders she hoped would keep China from capsizing. Let's set the scene in the late 1800, when China was eyeing the Western world with a mix of envy and exasperation. Europe was having its Industrial Revolution party, and China, well, China was still trying to figure out how not to trip over its own robes. Cixi, ever the pragmatist, realized that if you can't beat them, you might as well join them, at least when it came to technology. She commissioned the construction of modern arsenals, shipyards, and military academies, laying the groundwork for a naval force that could at least make a respectable splash. In 1888, the Beiyang fleet was established, touted as one of the most powerful naval forces in Asia at the time. And for a moment, it seemed like Cixi's vision was coming to life. But here's the catch. It came with a price tag that would make even modern defense contractors blush. The fleet cost a staggering 30 million taels of silver, an investment that could have outfitted several empires with their own fleets of battleships. Yet, despite the expense, the Beiyang fleet was a symbol of progress, a shiny testament to China's potential to flex its military muscles. Cixi also turned her gaze to the landlocked wonders of the telegraph. It sounds like a no-brainer today, but back then, convincing traditionalists that wires strung across the countryside could revolutionize communication was like trying to sell snow to the Eskimos. The court officials balked at the idea, fearing these demonic wires would somehow zap their Confucian virtues into oblivion. And let's not forget the logistical nightmare of threading telegraph lines across a country nearly as sprawling as the Internet's collection of cat memes. Despite the opposition, by the late 19th century, China boasted over 20,000 kilometers of telegraph lines, a feat that was nothing short of miraculous given the bureaucratic inertia. However, the real piece de resistance of Cixi's modernization effort was the infamous 100 days reform period of 1898. Here's where the plot thickens. Cixi stepped back, at least officially, allowing her nephew, the Guangxu Emperor, to dabble in reform. The reformers, under the emperor's watchful eye, unleashed a torrent of edicts aimed at dragging China kicking and screaming into the modern age. Education reforms, military overhauls, and a budding push for a constitutional monarchy. These reforms were as ambitious as they were overdue. But if you're expecting a happy ending, then you haven't been paying attention. The 100 days reform was like trying to sprint a marathon in flip-flops, doomed from the start. The conservative faction within the court, clutching to their traditions like a dog with a particularly tasty bone, were less than thrilled. They feared these reforms would unspool the very fabric of Chinese society, leaving a tangled mess of Western ideals and Chinese values. Their resistance was as intense as it was predictable, and Cixi, sensing the winds shifting, decided it was time to step back into the spotlight. With a deft political maneuver, she orchestrated a coup that effectively ended the 100 days reform, placing the Guangxu Emperor under house arrest and reasserting her control. The reforms were rolled back faster than a new diet plan after the holidays, and Cixi resumed her role as the empire's unofficial power broker. The whole affair was a sobering reminder that in China, change came slowly, if at all, and usually with a hefty side of political drama. Despite the setbacks, Cixi's initiatives were not entirely in vain. The seeds of modernization had been sown, and while they would take years to bear fruit, they marked the beginning of China's slow but steady march toward modernization. It was a classic case of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, an uneven dance that mirrored Cixi's own balancing act between tradition and progress. In the grand tapestry of history, Cixi's story is a testament to the complexity of change. She was a paradox wrapped in silk robes, a woman who embraced the future but never fully let go of the past. Her reign was a high-wire act of political gymnastics, an enduring lesson that in the world of power, nothing is ever as simple as it seems. So, as we continue this journey through her life, remember that behind every grand gesture and strategic maneuver was a woman who understood the art of survival better than most. Stay tuned, because her story has plenty of twists and turns left to unravel. As if Cixi didn't already have enough spinning plates in the air, the dawn of the 20th century decided to throw a few more her way. Enter the Boxer Rebellion, a movement that sounds like a new exercise craze, but was actually one of the most chaotic episodes in modern Chinese history. This wasn't your average revolt. It was a heady cocktail of anti-foreign sentiment, mystical martial arts, and a dash of imperial politics, all shaken, not stirred, into a confrontation that would test Cixi's political acumen to the limit. The Boxers, officially known as the Righteous and Harmonious Fists, were a grassroots militia with a serious grudge against foreigners and Chinese Christians. Picture a ragtag group of fighters who believed they could dodge bullets through spiritual invincibility, and you'll get a sense of the magical realism at play here. But while their kung fu movie bravado was questionable, their grievances were all too real. Western imperial powers had been carving up China like a holiday turkey, and the locals were fed up with being the stuffing. Cixi, ever the political chameleon, saw the Boxers not as a threat, but as an opportunity, an unlikely ally in her ongoing game of imperial chess. Her support wasn't exactly a ringing endorsement. It was more of a calculated gamble. She figured that by backing the Boxers, she could harness their anti-foreign fervor to push out the foreign powers that had been treating China like their personal playground. It was a risky move, like trying to ride a tiger and hoping it wouldn't turn around and bite. So, in the summer of 1900, with Cixi's tacit approval, the Boxers laid siege to Beijing. Their targets, the foreign legations, and anyone who looked like they might have imported their cultural values along with their top hats and tea sets. For 55 days, Beijing was a pressure cooker of tension, with foreign diplomats holed up in their embassies, probably wishing they'd opted for a safer career, like lion taming. But here's where the plot thickens. The Eight-Nation Alliance, a coalition of Western powers plus Japan, decided they weren't going to sit idly by while their citizens were under threat. They launched a military intervention that was less peacekeeping mission and more show of brute force, marching into Beijing with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Cixi, realizing that the Boxers were not quite the ace up her sleeve she'd hoped for, did what any savvy politician would do. She switched gears faster than a race car driver spotting a speed trap. In a dramatic pivot, Cixi fled Beijing, disguised as a peasant, leaving the imperial capital to the invaders. It was the ultimate walk of shame, but it was also a brilliant move of self-preservation. By retreating, she avoided direct confrontation with the overwhelming might of the foreign forces, living to fight another day. And fight she did, just not in the way anyone expected. In the aftermath of the rebellion, Cixi embarked on a PR campaign that would make even modern spin doctors envious. She cast herself not as the instigator, but as a hapless bystander caught up in the chaos. It was a classic case of scapegoating, with the Boxers taking the fall for the mess. And while historians debate her actual level of involvement, there's no denying her skill at rewriting the narrative to suit her needs. The Boxer Protocol, signed in 1901, was the formal end to the rebellion, and it was as harsh as expected. China was slapped with an indemnity of 450 million taels of silver, an amount so astronomical it makes today's national debts look like pocket change. Foreign troops were stationed in Beijing, and the Qing government was forced to execute pro-Boxer officials. It was a humiliating defeat, but Cixi, ever the phoenix rising from the ashes, used it as a springboard for reform. In the years that followed, she initiated a series of modernizing reforms that seemed to echo the very changes the 100 Days Reform had attempted. Educational overhauls, military restructuring, and even the beginnings of a constitutional monarchy were back on the table. It was a case of too little, too late, but it demonstrated Cixi's ability to adapt and survive, even when the chips were down. Now, let's take a breather and consider the myth-making. Was Cixi the villainous tyrant of popular imagination, or a misunderstood reformer trying to navigate impossible circumstances? The truth, as always, is somewhere in the messy middle. Her knack for scapegoating and myth-making was legendary. She understood that controlling the narrative was as important as controlling the empire. Cixi's story, with its twists and turns, is a reminder that history is seldom black and white. It's a complex tapestry woven from threads of ambition, survival, and the relentless march of time. As we prepare to delve into the final chapters of her life, it's clear that Cixi was not just a player in the Game of Thrones, but a master of it. So, stick around, because her legacy is about to take center stage, and you won't want to miss the final act. As Cixi's chapter in the grand Chinese epic continued to unfold, her knack for political puppetry took center stage. You see, if political intrigue were an art form, Cixi would have been its Picasso, except her canvases were throne rooms and her brushes, the lives of emperors. Let's dive into her later years, a period when Cixi deftly juggled the complexities of succession with the grace of a high-wire acrobat. Her main concern, securing the dynasty's future, of course, but also ensuring that the puppet strings led directly to her hands. It was a game of thrones that would have given even George R. Martin a run for his money. The heir situation was as straightforward as a labyrinth. Cixi's own son, the Tangzhai Emperor, had tragically died young in 1875, leaving the throne vacant. Enter her nephew, the Guangxu Emperor, who ascended at the tender age of 4. Now, having a toddler emperor is like having a toddler CEO, adorable in theory, but someone else needs to hold the reins. And who better than Cixi, the seasoned power broker? But the plot thickens. The Guangxu Emperor, once he matured, began to harbor independent ideas, particularly after the ill-fated 100 Days reform. Cixi, sensing a potential threat to her influence, managed to keep him on a tight leash, turning his reign into more of a ceremonial title than a position of power. She was the maestro, and he, the instrument, only his strings were rarely plucked without her approval. Cixi's political maneuvering didn't stop there. As the 20th century rolled in, she knew the importance of having a backup plan, or in this case, a backup heir. Enter Puyi, the last emperor of China, who was plucked from the imperial family tree and groomed for the throne at the age of just 2. His ascension was a strategic move, ensuring an heir who could be molded from cradle to crown under her watchful eye. Talk about planning for the future. This brings us to the intricate palace dynamics that Cixi navigated with the precision of a chess grandmaster. The Forbidden City wasn't just a palace. It was a microcosm of power plays, alliances, and rivalries. Cixi, with her sharp political instincts, knew that controlling the court meant controlling the empire. She maintained a delicate balance of power, cultivating relationships with key officials while neutralizing potential threats with the subtlety of a seasoned diplomat. And let's not forget the lavish lifestyle that Cixi was infamous for. Ah, yes, the Empress Dowager's affinity for luxury was the stuff of legend, a fact that critics often used to paint her as a self-indulgent despot. But let's put things into perspective. Yes, Cixi spent the equivalent of millions on lavish renovations of the summer palace, and yes, she had a penchant for opulent banquets that would make the Great Gatsby's soirees look like budget affairs. But here's the kicker. This extravagance was also a political tool. In a world where perception was reality, her grandeur was a demonstration of power and stability in an empire teetering on the brink. Now, let's talk about the paradox of Cixi's image as both a traditionalist and a reformer, a contradiction that continues to baffle historians. On one hand, she upheld many Confucian values, ensuring that the imperial court adhered to age-old rituals and customs. On the other hand, her later years were marked by a surprising embrace of reform. She supported educational initiatives, military modernization, and even flirted with the idea of a constitutional monarchy. It was a curious dance between holding onto the past and cautiously stepping into the future. But let's not romanticize things too much. Cixi wasn't some benevolent ruler with a reformist heart of gold. Her reforms were often reactive, spurred by necessity rather than conviction. The threat of foreign powers and internal unrest forced her hand, making modernization an unavoidable, albeit reluctant, reality. It's time to bust a few myths about Cixi's supposed behind-the-scenes antics. The image of her as a Machiavellian puppet master, while not entirely unfounded, often overshadows the complexities of her reign. Was she ruthless? Absolutely. But was she also a shrewd strategist, adept at navigating a patriarchal system designed to keep her sidelined? Without a doubt, Cixi's legacy is a testament to the art of survival in the treacherous world of imperial politics. She was a woman who wielded power in a man's world, a master of adaptation in a rapidly changing landscape. Her later years were a study in contrasts, extravagant yet pragmatic, conservative yet reformist. She was a living paradox, a figure who defied simple categorization and challenged the narrative of her time. As we prepare to delve into the final chapters of her life, it's clear that Cixi's story is far from over. Her legacy, like her life, is a tapestry woven with threads of ambition, power, and the relentless pursuit of survival. So, stay tuned, because the final act of her remarkable journey is about to unfold, and you won't want to miss it. As Cixi's story draws to a close, let's unravel the final act of this imperial drama, beginning with her final curtain call in 1908. Here's the scene. Empress Dowager Cixi, the indomitable force behind the king throne for nearly half a century, passes away at the age of 72. Her death marks not just the end of a life, but the beginning of the end for the Qing dynasty itself. Just a day before her departure, the Guangxu emperor, whom she had controlled with the precision of a puppeteer, also dies under mysterious circumstances. Coincidence? Perhaps, but history loves a juicy conspiracy, and this one's ripe for the picking. With Cixi gone, the already fragile Qing dynasty begins to unravel faster than a cheap sweater. Puyi, the 2-year-old emperor she had chosen as her successor, was certainly cute, but his reign was about as effective as using a chocolate teapot. Nice to look at, but not exactly practical. The real power vacuum was palpable, and the bureaucratic structure Cixi had carefully maintained over the years started to crumble without a steady hand. By 1912, just 4 years after her death, the Qing dynasty officially collapsed, bringing an end to over 2 millennia of imperial rule. It's the kind of plot twist that would make even the writers of Game of Thrones sit up and take notes. Now, let's delve into the legacy of Empress Dowager Cixi, a woman whose name is synonymous with both reform and regression, modernization and decadence. Her reign, much like a Rorschach test, reveals different interpretations depending on who's looking. Was she a visionary leader who planted the seeds of modernization, or a tyrant who clung to power at the empire's expense? The answer, unsurprisingly, is both. First, let's address her contributions to modernization. Under Cixi's rule, China took its first halting steps into the modern era. Railways snaked across the landscape, telegraph lines hummed with activity, and the fledgling Beiyang fleet represented a nascent nod to naval prowess. These were not mere footnotes in a reign. They were significant shifts in a country that had long resisted change. Yet these steps forward were often undermined by steps back, like diverting naval funds to renovate her summer palace, proving that in Cixi's world, appearances were sometimes more compelling than practicalities. Economically, Cixi's reign was a mixed bag. The Qing treasury was perpetually strained, not least because of the massive indemnities imposed by foreign powers after the Boxer Rebellion. Those 450 million taels of silver didn't just materialize out of thin air. Cixi had to juggle financial constraints while maintaining an empire that was, quite literally, falling apart at the seams. Her ability to navigate these fiscal challenges speaks to her political savvy, yet it also highlights the limitations of her reign. The modernization efforts, while a step in the right direction, were often too little, too late. Socially and politically, Cixi's era was one of contradictions. She maintained the Confucian traditions that had governed China for centuries, yet she also recognized the need for reform. Her later years were marked by attempts to implement educational reforms and even flirt with constitutionalism, ideas that were radical for their time but ultimately too incremental to stave off the tide of revolution. It's a classic case of trying to run a marathon with your shoelaces tied. You might make some progress, but you're bound to trip up eventually. Then there's the mythos of Cixi, the supposed dragon lady of the Forbidden City. This image, while captivating, often overshadows the more nuanced realities of her reign. Yes, she was ruthless, and yes, she wielded power with an iron fist, but she was also a product of her environment, a woman navigating a patriarchal society that was as unforgiving as it was complex. Her ability to rise through the ranks and maintain control for decades is a testament to her political acumen, not just her ambition. So why does Cixi's story matter to us today? Well, it's a potent reminder of the complexities of power and the intricate dance of progress. In a world where change is often met with resistance, Cixi's story resonates as a study in the art of the possible. She was a leader who understood that power wasn't just about what you did, but how you were perceived. In the end, her legacy is as much about the myth she inspired as the reality she shaped. For modern audiences, Cixi's tale is a rich tapestry of intrigue, strategy, and survival. It's a story that challenges us to reconsider our perceptions of power, to look beyond the legends, and uncover the truths that lie beneath. Her life was a masterclass in political chess, a game where the stakes were nothing less than the fate of an empire. And while her story might have ended over a century ago, its lessons echo through the corridors of history, reminding us that the dance of power is as timeless as it is treacherous. We wrap up this historical roller coaster. Let's leave with a few parting thoughts. Cixi's reign was a testament to the duality of progress and tradition, a reminder that the path to modernization is seldom straightforward. Her legacy, like her life, is a blend of grandeur and grit, ambition and adaptation. In the grand narrative of history, Cixi stands out as a figure who defied the odds, a woman who wielded power with a deft touch in a world that was anything but gentle. So, the next time you find yourself pondering the complexities of history and the people who shaped it, remember Empress Dowager Cixi. Her story is a vivid illustration of the fact that history is not just a collection of dates and events, but a living, breathing entity shaped by the people who dared to dream, to scheme, and to strive. And in that regard, Cixi was truly in a league of her own.